Sobibór was built to disappear people, not imprison them, not register them, not keep records of their suffering. It was designed for arrival and then absence. Hidden deep in the forests of eastern Poland, Sobibór was one of the 3 secret extermination camps of Operation Reinhard. Trains arrived daily. Doors opened. Orders were shouted. Within hours, entire families were gone. Their names erased, their belongings sorted, their bodies buried in mass graves and later burned to ash. Almost no one was meant to survive. The camp was small, a factory of silence. And yet, in October 1943, inside a place designed for total control, something unimaginable happened. Prisoners, starving, beaten, surrounded by barbed wire and machine guns, began to organize. Quietly, under the eyes of the SS, they studied guard routines. They whispered plans. They decided that if death was certain, then rebellion was their final act of humanity. What followed would become the largest successful uprising inside a Nazi extermination camp. We follow its creation, its machinery of murder, and the extraordinary revolt that shattered the illusion that no one could fight back. Because Sobibór was built for silence. But it did not remain silent forever. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The forest that hid a secret. Long before Sobibór became a symbol of resistance, it was chosen for silence. The site lay in a remote stretch of eastern Poland, near a small railway station surrounded by dense forest and sandy soil. It was not selected by accident. Isolation was strategy. Trees blocked visibility. Villages were sparse. Rail lines connected directly to larger ghettos. The landscape itself would become an accomplice, absorbing sound, concealing smoke, and swallowing evidence. When the Nazis began planning Operation Reinhard in 1941, they were not improvising chaos. They were engineering disappearance. Sobibór would not resemble a traditional concentration camp like Dachau or Sachsenhausen. There would be no vast stone gates meant to intimidate. No large industrial complexes visible from miles away. Instead, the design was compact, efficient, and deadly. It existed for one purpose: immediate extermination. By the time construction began in early 1942, the machinery of genocide was already in motion elsewhere. Chelmno had begun using gas vans. Belzec was under construction. The Nazi leadership had moved beyond persecution and deportation. The final solution had become policy. Sobibór would serve as one of the central killing sites for Jews deported primarily from Poland, the Netherlands, Slovakia, France, and other occupied territories. Its scale would be smaller than Auschwitz, but its function was more singular. Almost no one sent to Sobibór was meant to live beyond a few hours. The camp's layout was divided into carefully controlled zones. Camp I held administrative offices and barracks for the small number of Jewish prisoners temporarily spared for forced labor. Camp 2 served as the reception and undressing area where arriving deportees were deceived into believing they were being processed for resettlement. Camp 3, hidden entirely from new arrivals, contained the gas chambers and burial pits. The separation was deliberate. No prisoner in Camp I could easily see Camp 3. No arriving family could glimpse what waited ahead. Barbed wire was woven with pine branches to block sight lines. Guard towers stood at critical points. The illusion of order masked the certainty of death. The personnel stationed at Sobibór were relatively few, roughly 20 to 30 German SS officers, supported by a larger group of trained auxiliaries, many of whom were recruited from Soviet prisoners of war. The small staff was not a weakness. It was a reflection of the camp's streamlined purpose. Killing did not require thousands of guards when deception and terror did most of the work. Deportees arrived exhausted from transport in sealed cattle cars. They were disoriented, dehydrated, and frightened. Loud commands and threats were enough to maintain control. The system depended on speed. Speed reduced resistance. Speed prevented panic from spreading. Speed allowed the camp to process entire transports in a single day. From the outside, Sobibór did not look like a center of annihilation. It looked temporary. Wooden barracks, fences, a modest railway spur extending into the clearing. But inside those fences, routines were already forming. Routines that would soon claim the lives of hundreds of thousands. When trains pulled in, prisoners forced into labor roles would clean the platforms, remove bodies from previous transports, and sort confiscated belongings. Valuables were catalogued and sent back to the Reich. Clothing was disinfected and redistributed. Even hair cut from victims would be packaged and shipped for industrial use. Nothing was wasted. Death itself was organized into supply chains. The forest absorbed the sounds. Gunshots did not echo far. The hum of engines from the gas chambers blended into the background. Burial pits were dug deep into sandy soil, later to be reopened when the Nazis ordered bodies exhumed and burned to erase evidence. At this early stage, however, the focus was efficiency, not concealment. Sobibór was part of a larger network of extermination sites working in coordination. Timetables were synchronized with deportations from ghettos. Bureaucrats hundreds of miles away calculated transport capacity and train schedules. The camp's existence was both secret and bureaucratically documented. Silence on the ground coexisted with paperwork in offices. For the first deportees arriving in the spring of 1942, there were no rumors yet strong enough to overpower hope. Many believed they were being relocated for labor. The signage, the shouted orders, even the instructions to tie shoes together before undressing. All were framed as temporary steps. You will shower, they were told. Your belongings will be returned. Deception was not incidental. It was operational doctrine. Panic could slow the process. Calm increased compliance. And so Sobibór functioned as a theater of lies. Within weeks, transports became daily events. Entire communities disappeared in a matter of hours. The camp's gas chambers, initially powered by a gasoline engine pumping carbon monoxide, were expanded to increase capacity. What began as 3 chambers soon grew larger. The goal was simple: reduce waiting time. The fewer hours victims remained alive inside the camp, the lower the risk of unrest. Yet even in this carefully engineered system, cracks would eventually appear. Forced labor prisoners witnessed fragments of truth. They saw belongings accumulate without owners. They smelled smoke from burial pits. They carried bodies. Knowledge spread in whispers. And in a place built to prevent survival, survival itself became an act of observation. Sobibór's first months were defined by rhythm, trains, deception, gas, burial, sorting, shipment. The routine repeated until it felt mechanical. To the architects of the camp, it was a success. To the victims, it was an ending without warning. But hidden inside the forest, beneath the layers of silence, the story of Sobibór was only beginning. Chapter 1, Segment 2. Arrival without return. The trains arrived without ceremony. There were no announcements, no signs explaining where the passengers had come, and no clear indication of where they had been brought. The journey itself had already stripped away certainty. Days sealed inside wooden freight cars with barely any air, no sanitation, and almost no water had left the deportees weak and disoriented. Children cried until they no longer had the strength to cry. Elderly men leaned against walls that shook with every turn of the tracks. Mothers tried to reassure their families with fragments of hope they did not fully believe. Somewhere along the line, rumor had mixed with denial. Some had heard whispers about resettlement in the East. Others had heard darker stories, but disbelief is powerful, especially when survival depends on it. When the doors of the cattle cars finally slid open at Sobibór, the shock was not immediate horror but confusion. Sunlight blinded those who had been in darkness for days. Guards shouted in German and Polish. Dogs barked. Armed men ordered everyone out quickly, urging speed and threatening violence for hesitation. The deportees stepped down onto a sandy platform surrounded by trees. There were no visible factories, no sprawling prison compounds. Just wooden buildings and barbed wire partially concealed by branches. The setting felt temporary, almost rural. It did not look like a place where tens of thousands had already died. SS officers oversaw the process with practiced efficiency. A brief speech was often delivered. They had arrived at a transit camp, they were told. They would shower and be disinfected before continuing on to labor assignments. Their belongings would be catalogued and returned later. Jewelry and valuables were to be handed over for safekeeping. The words were calm, rehearsed, authoritative. Some deportees clung to them. Others sensed something wrong but saw no clear alternative. The separation began immediately. Men were directed to one side, women and children to another. Families tried to stay together, sometimes slipping across lines, only to be forced back by guards. The division was presented as administrative necessity, nothing more. But it was the first irreversible step. Once separated, husbands and wives would never see each other again. Parents lost sight of children within minutes. Panic flickered in the crowd but was suppressed by confusion and the presence of armed guards. The deception depended on momentum. A small group of prisoners in striped clothing moved through the crowd, assisting with instructions. These were Jewish inmates forced into labor roles within the camp. They spoke gently when possible, translating orders, encouraging compliance. Many had already learned that resistance meant immediate execution. They balanced survival with unbearable awareness. They saw transports arrive knowing that almost no one would leave alive. Yet they were compelled to help maintain the illusion. From the platform, deportees were marched toward Camp 2, the undressing barracks. The path was lined with barbed wire disguised with pine branches. Guards walked alongside, shouting for order. In the undressing area, men and women were directed into separate buildings. They were instructed to remove clothing neatly and tie shoes together. Belongings were stacked carefully, as if they truly would be reclaimed. Mothers folded children's coats. Elderly women tucked family photographs into pockets one last time. The normality of these gestures deepened the tragedy. They were acts of routine in a place where routine had been weaponized. Those who hesitated were struck. Those who questioned were silenced. The process moved quickly. Naked and frightened, groups were then directed through a narrow, fenced-in pathway that prisoners grimly nicknamed the Tube. It curved through the trees, preventing visibility of what lay ahead. The design was intentional. No one waiting behind could see the fate of those already moving forward. The path ended at the gas chambers in Camp 3, a section completely hidden from new arrivals. Inside the gas chambers, victims were packed tightly. Doors were sealed. An engine started outside, pumping carbon monoxide into the enclosed space. Within minutes, the air became unbreathable. Screams rose and then faded. The engine noise continued until silence fell. Guards waited before opening the doors. Then labor prisoners were forced to remove the bodies, disentangle limbs, search for hidden valuables, and prepare the chambers for the next group. The routine began again almost immediately. What made Sobibór especially lethal was its speed. Entire transports of hundreds could be processed in a matter of hours. There was no prolonged imprisonment, no gradual deterioration over months or years. Most deportees were dead the same day they arrived. The camp was built to minimize visibility and maximize throughput. Efficiency was measured not in human terms but in numbers processed per transport. Yet amid this calculated system, moments of humanity persisted in fragile ways. A whispered prayer, a hand squeezed in farewell, a final attempt to shield a child's eyes. These gestures could not stop what was happening, but they testified to the persistence of identity even as the system sought to erase it. By the end of Sobibór's first months of operation, the routine had become mechanical. Trains arrived on schedule. Deception unfolded with practiced precision. Bodies were buried in mass graves. The forest stood silent around it all. But beneath that silence, knowledge was growing, among forced labor prisoners who witnessed every step. They understood that Sobibór was not a transit camp. It was a factory of death. And in that understanding, something else quietly began to form. The first seeds of defiance. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The camp designed for silence. By the time the third transport of the day arrived, the rhythm of Sobibór was already in motion. Orders had been shouted, lines divided, belongings collected, and the first groups sent down the narrow path toward the hidden heart of the camp. Nothing about the process was chaotic. It was structured, deliberate, and rehearsed. That was the most chilling truth of all. Sobibór was not improvised brutality. It was engineered silence. Unlike large concentration camps that sprawled across visible landscapes, Sobibór was compact and concealed. The forest was not just scenery. It was part of the design. Pine trees formed a natural barrier against sight and sound. Barbed wire was camouflaged with branches. The gas chambers were positioned beyond curves and fences so that no arriving prisoner could see what awaited ahead. Even the layout of the pathways was intentional, controlled lines of movement, no cross-visibility, no chance for witnesses among the newly arrived. Sobibór was divided into clearly defined sections. Camp I housed the administrative buildings and barracks for forced labor prisoners. Camp 2 served as the reception and undressing area for new transports. Camp 3, the most secret section, contained the gas chambers and mass graves. Only a small number of selected Jewish prisoners were allowed into Camp 3, and even they lived under constant threat of execution. The compartments of the camp functioned like stages in a production line. Each had a specific purpose. Each was designed to ensure that killing could proceed without interruption. The SS officers stationed at Sobibór were not numerous, but they relied on auxiliary guards, many recruited from occupied territories, to enforce control. Orders were given crisply. Hesitation was punished immediately. Yet brutality was not always loud. The deception required a tone of routine authority. Victims were reassured, instructed, hurried forward. The appearance of order made resistance harder. The illusion of procedure masked the reality of extermination. Inside Camp 3, the killing continued with industrial repetition. At first, victims were buried in large pits dug by forced laborers. Later, as mass graves filled and concerns arose about concealment, the bodies were exhumed and burned on open-air pyres. Prisoners assigned to this task endured unimaginable trauma, handling the remains of thousands while knowing they themselves would eventually be replaced and killed. The fire pits burned day and night, smoke rising through the trees, blending with mist and forest air. From a distance, nothing seemed extraordinary. Up close, the ground itself had been transformed into evidence. For the Jewish prisoners selected to work in Sobibór, survival was a daily negotiation with horror. They cut hair from women moments before execution. They sorted clothing for shipment back to Germany. They cleaned barracks that would never be reused by the people who had just occupied them. Every object became part of the system. Shoes were bundled. Gold teeth were extracted. Suitcases were opened and emptied. The Nazis understood that genocide could be sustained by logistics as much as by ideology. Every transport meant valuables. Every death meant material to be reclaimed. But even in this closed system, cracks began to form, not in the structure of the camp, but in the minds of those forced to serve within it. Prisoners observed patterns. They counted guards. They memorized schedules. They noted where weapons were stored, how fences were patrolled, how frequently trains arrived. Survival sharpened awareness, and awareness slowly nurtured resolve. The Nazis believed Sobibór would leave no witnesses. Most who entered were killed within hours. The labor prisoners were periodically executed and replaced to prevent knowledge from spreading. Records were minimal. No photographs were meant for public eyes. Sobibór's existence was both operational and secret, a camp built to function efficiently and then disappear without trace. Yet the very system that aimed to erase memory inadvertently created observers. Each forced laborer who survived another day carried inside them a record more powerful than paper. They remembered the layout. They remembered the faces of officers. They remembered the sounds of engines, the sequence of commands, the smell of burning. Silence surrounded the camp, but memory endured within it. As 1942 turned into 1943, the pace of extermination continued relentlessly. Transports arrived from across occupied Poland and beyond. Entire communities vanished within a single afternoon. The machinery of death showed no sign of slowing. And still, in whispered conversations inside barracks after nightfall, prisoners began to ask impossible questions. Could escape be imagined? Could a revolt succeed in a place designed so precisely to prevent it? The forest that shielded Sobibór also held secrets. Beyond the fences lay uncertainty, danger, and the vast territory of occupied Europe. But for the first time, some prisoners began to consider that the forest might represent more than concealment. It might represent possibility. Sobibór had been constructed as a closed circuit: transport, deception, extermination, erasure. The Nazis believed the system was complete. They believed fear would silence thought. They believed no one inside would ever organize resistance in a place where death was constant and immediate. They were wrong. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The Mechanics of Murder. By 1942, Sobibór was no longer an experiment. It was a functioning mechanism, calibrated, timed, and optimized. The chaos of early operations had been replaced with method. The camp no longer merely killed. It processed. Every transport that arrived at the small railway spur near the forest followed a predictable rhythm, one refined through repetition and ruthless efficiency. Trains arrived without ceremony. Freight cars, often sealed for days, carried men, women, and children packed so tightly that many were already dead by the time the doors were opened. Guards shouted orders. Dogs barked. Prisoners were forced into formation on the ramp. Panic flickered in the air, but it was quickly managed. The key to Sobibór's operation was speed and disorientation. Victims were not given time to understand where they were. An SS officer would step forward and deliver a practice speech. The message rarely changed. They had arrived at a transit camp. They would be disinfected before being sent to labor in the East. Belongings would be returned after processing. Resistance would bring punishment. Cooperation would bring safety. The speech was brief, authoritative, and delivered with the confidence of routine. It was not meant to convince completely, only to delay doubt long enough to move people forward. Selection in Sobibór's early phase was minimal. Unlike Auschwitz, where labor and extermination coexisted in complex systems, Sobibór was designed primarily for immediate killing. Only a small percentage, usually young, physically capable individuals, were chosen temporarily for work details inside the camp. The rest were sent directly through the sequence that led to death. From the ramp, prisoners were directed toward Camp 2, the reception area. Signs pointed to baths and disinfection. Barbed wire fences, cleverly disguised with pine branches, created corridors that prevented anyone from seeing beyond the immediate path. Guards maintained urgency. The faster the victims moved, the less time there was for realization. In the undressing yard, families were separated under the pretense of efficiency. Women and children were guided one way, men another. Valuables were surrendered and sorted immediately by work prisoners. Jewelry, currency, watches, even photographs were taken and catalogued. Suitcases were stacked with meticulous order. The Nazis understood that murder could be profitable. Sobibór was not only a killing center, it was a site of systematic plunder. Victims were instructed to undress quickly. Clothing was to be folded neatly, shoes tied together in pairs. Order was demanded even at the threshold of annihilation. Those who hesitated were beaten. Those who resisted were shot. The deception was fragile, but fear and confusion often prevented organized rebellion. Mothers tried to calm children. Elderly men clutched belongings that would never be returned. From there, they were herded into what prisoners later called the Schlouch, the tube. It was a narrow, fenced pathway leading to Camp 3, hidden from view. Pine branches lined the wire. The path curved intentionally so that no one could see the gas chambers until it was too late. Guards forced them to run. Whips cracked. Shouts echoed. The urgency prevented the crowd from stopping, from turning back. At the end of the path stood small brick buildings with metal doors. These were presented as shower facilities. Inside, the rooms were crowded far beyond capacity. Once sealed, carbon monoxide from engine exhaust was pumped into the chambers. Within minutes, the air turned lethal. Panic, suffocation, silence. Then nothing. Outside, members of the Sonderkommando, themselves prisoners, waited for the doors to reopen. Their task was immediate and brutal. Bodies were removed, searched for hidden valuables, gold teeth extracted. The dead were transported to burial pits or later to burning sites. The chamber floors were cleaned, and the process began again. The entire sequence, from arrival to death, could take less than 2 hours. Sobibór's efficiency depended on compartmentalization. Prisoners working in one section rarely saw the full picture. Those in Camp I repaired uniforms, sorted goods, or maintained infrastructure. Those in Camp 2 processed belongings. Only those in Camp 3 witnessed the final stage, and they lived under constant threat of execution to prevent testimony. The system was designed so that knowledge was fragmented. The fewer who understood the whole, the less likely resistance would form. The guards relied not only on violence but on rhythm. Regularity numbed awareness. Transports arrived daily. Work details rotated. Executions of labor prisoners occurred periodically to erase witnesses. Every element was calculated to sustain secrecy. Yet beneath the mechanical precision, tension simmered. Prisoners noticed patterns. They recognized that no one who entered Camp 3 returned. They understood that the smoke rising above the trees carried more than mist. Even without official confirmation, the truth seeped through routine. Sobibór's structure mirrored a factory, but its product was absence. Communities disappeared. Names vanished. Entire towns were erased in a single afternoon. The paperwork that accompanied each transport recorded numbers, not lives. The system reduced humanity to inventory, and still the machinery continued to turn, relentless, silent, and terrifyingly organized. But even the most efficient machine has weaknesses. And within Sobibór's tightly controlled compartments, small fractures were beginning to appear. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Life inside the machinery. For those not sent immediately to the gas chambers, Sobibór offered no reprieve, only postponement. The small percentage selected for labor entered a different kind of torment. They were spared from instant death not out of mercy, but necessity. The camp required hands to function. It required prisoners to sort, carry, repair, clean, and conceal. Survival meant service to the system that was killing everyone else. The work prisoners were divided into units. Some remained in Camp I, where workshops repaired confiscated clothing and shoes. Tailors stitched German uniforms from garments taken from the murdered. Cobblers patched boots that would be worn by soldiers at the front. Others were assigned to Camp II, where mountains of personal belongings were sorted with mechanical speed. Suitcases were opened and emptied. Photographs were tossed aside. Wedding rings were separated from costume jewelry. Foreign currency was counted and stacked. Everything had value to the Reich. A smaller, more isolated group worked in Camp 3, the killing center itself. These men lived closest to horror. They dragged bodies from gas chambers, cut hair from women's heads, removed gold teeth, and transported corpses to burial pits. Later, when the Nazis ordered mass cremations to destroy evidence, these same prisoners were forced to exhume decomposing bodies and burn them on open-air pyres. The smoke hung constantly above the trees. The smell seeped into skin and memory. Life inside Sobibór was ruled by absolute unpredictability. Beatings occurred without warning. Executions were arbitrary. Guards shot prisoners for pausing too long, for glancing in the wrong direction, for appearing weak. Dogs were trained to attack. Public punishments reinforced fear. A single act of defiance could lead to collective reprisal. Food was minimal, thin soup, crusts of bread. Hunger gnawed at the body and mind. Disease spread quickly in overcrowded barracks. Yet even in starvation, prisoners found ways to preserve fragments of dignity. They shared crumbs. They whispered prayers. They memorized the names of the dead, knowing that survival might mean bearing witness. The SS officers treated the camp as both workplace and theater of power. Some displayed calculated cruelty. Others operated with detached efficiency. For them, Sobibór was assignment and advancement. Promotions depended on productivity. The faster transports were processed, the more successful the operation appeared. Murder was reduced to numbers on reports. Communication between prisoner groups was tightly controlled, yet information traveled through glances and fragments of conversation. Workers in Camp 2 noticed that no one returned from Camp 3. Those in Camp 3 understood fully what the gas chambers meant. Over time, a shared awareness formed, a silent recognition that Sobibór was not temporary detention but annihilation. The psychological burden was immense. To survive meant participating in the system. Prisoners were forced to assist in the destruction of their own communities. Many struggled with guilt, though choice had long since been removed. Refusal meant immediate execution and replacement by another. Despite constant surveillance, small networks of solidarity emerged. Certain prisoners learned German to understand orders more clearly. Others memorized guard routines. A few managed to smuggle scraps of information between camps. Hope was fragile but not entirely extinguished. The camp's geography enforced separation. Barbed wire walls, camouflaged with branches, cut off sightlines. Watchtowers stood at regular intervals. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter at night. The forest, once protective cover, now functioned as prison boundary. Escape attempts were rare and usually fatal. Those caught were tortured publicly before execution. As months passed, the rhythm of transports continued. Entire Jewish communities from Poland, the Netherlands, France, and beyond were consumed. With each train, the number of potential witnesses grew smaller. Sobibór was designed to leave almost no survivors. Yet the very need for labor created vulnerability. The system depended on prisoners who understood its operations. And understanding can lead to planning. Within barracks after dark, in whispered conversations, the first fragile ideas of resistance began to take shape. They were not yet organized. They were questions more than plans. Could guards be deceived? Could weapons be obtained? Could the forest, once prison wall, become a path to freedom? The machinery of Sobibór appeared invincible. But beneath its routine, tension gathered quietly, like pressure building inside sealed chambers. And pressure eventually demands release. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Awareness, Desperation, and the First Seeds of Revolt. By the summer of 1943, Sobibór had become a place suspended between routine and dread. The transport still arrived, the sorting details still worked, the gas chambers still operated with chilling regularity. Yet something had shifted among the prisoners who remained alive inside its fences. Awareness had deepened. The illusion of survival through usefulness had faded. Those who labored in Camp I and Camp II understood fully now that their exemption from immediate death was temporary. Sobibór was not a prison with sentences. It was a system with an end point. Information traveled in fragments, carried in hushed whispers between work details, passed during moments when guards turned their backs. Prisoners in Camp 3, forced to manage the bodies of the murdered, confirmed what others already suspected. No one who entered the gas chambers emerged alive. Entire transports vanished within hours. The forest concealed mass graves, later reopened when orders came to exhume and burn the corpses in an effort to erase evidence. Smoke rose day after day, a grim reminder that the camp was devouring not only people but traces of its crimes. Fear remained constant, but it was no longer paralyzing in the same way. Desperation had begun to replace it. The knowledge that death was inevitable changed calculations. If survival through obedience was temporary, then obedience itself lost its logic. For many prisoners, the question shifted from whether they would die to how they would face that certainty. Within this atmosphere, small circles of trust formed. Prisoners gravitated toward those who had demonstrated courage or resourcefulness. Among them were individuals with military backgrounds, political experience, or simply strong will. They observed the guards closely, noting habits, weaknesses, patterns. Which SS officer visited the tailor shop alone? Which Ukrainian guard could be lured with promises of stolen valuables? Where were tools stored? How long did it take for a body to be discovered? The structure of the camp, once designed to prevent resistance, also created predictable routines. Guards expected compliance. They relied on prisoners to carry out daily functions. Workshops provided tools, axes, hammers, knives, ostensibly for labor. The forest that ringed Sobibór, though filled with mines and patrols, still represented open space beyond the fences. These details, once merely part of survival, began to look like pieces of a fragile possibility. At the same time, morale fluctuated. Some prisoners believed revolt was impossible. They had witnessed public executions and mass shootings. They knew collective punishment was swift and brutal. If an escape attempt failed, hundreds could die in retaliation. The risk was enormous. Yet the alternative, passive continuation within a death factory, offered no true safety. In September 1943, a significant change altered the camp's internal dynamic. A transport of Soviet Jewish prisoners of war arrived. Men who had survived the Eastern Front and carried with them military training and discipline. Among them was Lieutenant Alexander Petchersky, Unlike many civilian deportees, these men understood strategy, deception, and coordinated action. Their presence injected new energy into discussions that had previously been abstract. Pechersky and other prisoners began meeting discreetly with existing leaders within the camp. Plans evolved from vague hope to structured intent. The idea was not merely to flee individually but to dismantle enough of the camp's command structure to create confusion, to kill key SS officers quietly, seize weapons, cut communication lines, and then lead as many prisoners as possible through the gates before reinforcements could respond. The plan depended on secrecy. Every additional person informed increased the risk of betrayal. Meetings took place under the pretext of workshop duties. Conversations were masked by the noise of machinery. Trust was extended cautiously. Some prisoners were excluded, not from cruelty, but necessity. If captured, they could not betray what they did not know. Meanwhile, the camp continued functioning outwardly as before. Transports arrived. Gas chambers operated. Smoke drifted upward. Guards barked orders. Yet beneath the surface, tension tightened. Prisoners began memorizing routes through the forest. They studied the placement of mines. They counted ammunition on guard belts. They rehearsed, silently, the timing required to strike. Not everyone believed success was possible, but many concluded that even failure carried meaning. To resist, even briefly, would fracture the narrative of total control. Sobibór was built to erase witnesses and suppress defiance. An uprising would prove that even within a death camp, human agency could not be entirely extinguished. As October approached, the plan solidified. Axes would be used in tailor shops and workshops to eliminate SS officers one by one under the guise of fittings and inspections. Weapons would be taken from the fallen. Communication lines would be cut. At a signal, prisoners would assemble near the main gate and attempt a mass breakout. The risks were undeniable. Mines lay beyond the fences. Machine guns overlooked the perimeter. Many would likely fall. But by then, many prisoners had already decided. If death was certain, it would not be met in silence. Sobibór had been designed as a place where resistance seemed unthinkable. Soon, it would become the site of one of the most daring revolts of the Holocaust. Chapter 3, Segment 1. October 14, 1943, the plan set in motion. By mid-October, the forest surrounding Sobibór had begun to turn with the quiet colors of autumn. Leaves fell soundlessly beyond the barbed wire, and the air carried the first edge of cold. Inside the camp, however, tension pressed heavily against every movement. The plan that had been whispered, refined, and rehearsed in fragments was now tied to a date. October 14, 1943. There would be no second chance. The uprising depended on precision, deception, and silence. The strategy was simple in design but enormous in risk. Individual SS officers would be lured one by one into workshops under routine pretexts: fittings for new boots, inspections of leather goods, the collection of valuables. There, they would be killed quickly and quietly with tools already present. Axes, knives, heavy implements. Their bodies would be hidden. Their weapons would be seized. Communication lines would be cut. At a designated signal, prisoners would gather near the main gate, armed with whatever rifles and pistols they had taken, and attempt a mass escape before the alarm could fully mobilize the guards. The plan required timing so exact that minutes could determine life or death. Alexander Pechersky, along with Leon Feldhendler and other key organizers, coordinated final instructions the evening before. Each assigned prisoner knew only what he needed to know. Tailors understood which officer would visit them first. Cobblers knew the hour their target would arrive. Others were tasked with securing the armory, sabotaging telephone lines, or guiding the larger group toward the perimeter once chaos erupted. The greatest fear was discovery. If even one SS officer became suspicious too early, the entire camp could be sealed within seconds. Machine guns were positioned at the watchtowers. Ukrainian guards patrolled the fences. Mines lay beyond certain sections of the perimeter. Surprise was the uprising's only true weapon. On the morning of October 14th, the camp operated as usual. Prisoners reported to work details. Guards conducted roll call. The gas chambers remained silent that day. No transport had arrived. That absence, unexpected and unexplained, worked in favor of the plan. The camp was not operating at peak intensity. Attention drifted. Shortly before 4 p.m., the first stage began. SS Untersturmführer Johann Niemann, the deputy commandant, was summoned to the tailor shop under the pretext of trying on a newly altered coat. Inside the cramped workspace, prisoners greeted him with forced politeness. As he removed his jacket and examined himself in a mirror, one of the men stepped behind him with an axe. The blow was swift and fatal. Niemann collapsed without a sound. His body was quickly hidden. His weapon was taken. Elsewhere in the camp, similar scenes unfolded. Officers were invited into workshops individually, their sense of superiority working against them. They did not expect resistance from men they viewed as broken. One by one, several SS personnel were killed in silence. For a brief moment, the plan appeared to be succeeding. Prisoners moved quickly, retrieving hidden weapons and passing word through coded phrases. Some cut telephone wires to prevent immediate communication with outside units. The clock ticked relentlessly. The window for escape was narrow. But then, a complication. One of the targeted officers failed to appear at his scheduled location. Another body was discovered sooner than expected. A Ukrainian guard noticed unusual movement. Suspicion began to ripple outward. The organizers realized the element of surprise was dissolving. At approximately 5 p.m., the signal was given earlier than planned. A whistle pierced the air. Prisoners abandoned subtlety. They ran toward the main gate, toward the fences, toward any opening that might lead beyond the camp's control. Chaos erupted instantly. Guards shouted. Shots rang out from watchtowers. Some prisoners fell within seconds. Others pressed forward regardless. The main gate was partially obstructed. Barbed wire tore clothing and skin. Mines exploded beyond certain sections of the perimeter, sending shockwaves through the forest's edge. Yet hundreds surged ahead. In those moments, Sobibór, built to extinguish resistance, was overwhelmed by it. Prisoners armed with stolen rifles fired back when they could. Others used tools, rocks, bare hands. Smoke, shouting, gunfire, and confusion swallowed the ordered routine that had defined the camp for months. The precise system of control fractured under the weight of unexpected defiance. Many would die in the attempt, but many would break through. For the first time since its creation, Sobibór was no longer functioning as designed. It had become a battlefield. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Breaking the Perimeter. The first seconds after the signal felt unreal, as if time itself hesitated before collapsing. Then sound returned all at once. Shouts in German. Gunfire from the towers. The crack of rifles echoing against wooden barracks. Men running not in lines, but in instinctive bursts toward any direction that seemed less guarded than another. The camp, so carefully engineered for order, dissolved into movement. Some prisoners rushed toward the main gate as originally planned. Others, realizing that guards were converging there, veered toward the barbed wire along the sides of the camp. The fences had always symbolized finality. Now they became the only path forward. A group managed to reach the armory building, but it was locked. There was no time to force it open. Weapons would have to come from the fallen. Rifles taken from dead SS officers were passed quickly from hand to hand. Ammunition was scarce. Every shot had to matter. From the watchtowers, machine guns opened fire. Bullets tore through the fleeing crowd. Some men fell immediately. Others stumbled but kept running. The ground near the perimeter was uneven and partially mined, a fact known to many prisoners. Still, stopping meant certain death. Running at least carried the possibility of survival. One section of the fence became the focus of desperate effort. Prisoners grabbed wooden planks, ladders, anything they could use to bridge the wire. Others threw themselves directly onto the barbs, creating human ladders for those behind them.
Skin-Tore.
Clothing shredded. The wire bent under weight and momentum. Then came the explosions. Mines detonated beneath feet racing too fast to see where they landed. Dirt and debris rose into the air. Bodies were thrown sideways. For a moment, panic threatened to undo everything. But the momentum did not stop. Couldn't. Too many had already committed to the run. Beyond the fence lay forest. Dense, unfamiliar, and filled with unknown danger. But it was also space without watchtowers. Approximately 300 prisoners managed to breach the perimeter during those frantic minutes. Some escaped in organized clusters, following men who had studied the terrain. Others ran alone, driven by instinct rather than plan. They scattered into the trees as shots followed them from behind. Inside the camp, the fighting continued. Guards attempted to regroup. Ukrainian auxiliaries fired into the crowd. Some SS officers who had survived the initial attacks began organizing resistance. The moment of complete surprise had passed. Now it was a matter of containment. Not everyone chose or was able to flee. Several prisoners remained behind, either wounded, disoriented, or convinced that escape was impossible. Others were trapped in areas cut off by gunfire. The revolt, which had begun with quiet precision, now unfolded in fragments. Acts of individual courage amid widespread chaos. Within less than an hour, the main surge was over. Sobibór was damaged but not destroyed. The revolt had shattered its illusion of total control, yet the SS still held parts of the camp. Dead guards lay hidden in workshops. Prisoners' bodies lay near the fences and across the yard. Smoke hung low in the cooling air. Outside the perimeter, the forest absorbed the sound of flight. Those who escaped now faced a different trial. The surrounding countryside was hostile territory. Patrols would soon be dispatched. Local collaborators might report unfamiliar faces. Food, shelter, and direction were uncertain. The uprising had achieved the unthinkable, but survival beyond the fence was not guaranteed. As night approached, scattered groups moved cautiously through brush and undergrowth. Some followed Petrsky and other leaders who attempted to maintain cohesion. Others drifted away, hoping anonymity would offer protection. Behind them, Sobibór entered a new phase. The SS began immediate retaliation. Prisoners who had not escaped were assembled. Interrogations followed. Executions would soon come. The camp's command structure, shaken but not eliminated, understood the gravity of what had occurred. A death camp had been breached from within. For the Nazis, Sobibór had served a single purpose: efficiency without witnesses. Now witnesses were running through the forest, and that fact alone changed everything. Chapter 3, Segment 3. After the breakout, by nightfall, the forest around Sobibór was no longer silent. Branches snapped beneath hurried footsteps. Breath came in sharp bursts, visible in the cooling October air. The men who had crossed the fence were no longer prisoners inside a camp, but they were not yet free. Behind them, alarm signals spread outward. Within hours, German patrols would comb the surrounding countryside. The escape had begun. The hunt was already forming. The fugitives faced an immediate and brutal reality. Sobibór had been designed in isolation for a reason. It stood amid marshland and woodland, distant from large population centers. The terrain that had concealed the camp now threatened to trap those fleeing it. Some escapees attempted to stay together in organized groups. Alexander Petchersky, calm even after the chaos, urged coordination. He understood that numbers offered strength. But fear fractured unity. Gunfire still echoed in the distance. The instinct to survive pulled men in different directions. Small groups splintered away, hoping that fewer footprints meant fewer chances of detection. The first night was spent moving. No fires, no loud voices, only whispers and the constant awareness that any sudden noise could end everything. Several escapees were wounded by bullets, by shrapnel from mines, by barbed wire. There was no medical care waiting in the forest. Bandages were improvised from torn shirts. Some men who had crossed the fence would not survive the journey beyond it. Meanwhile, inside Sobibór, the SS reacted with fury and calculation. The scale of the revolt stunned them. A camp built for deception and routine extermination had experienced organized rebellion. Guards who had believed themselves unchallengeable were dead. Weapons were missing. The illusion of absolute control was broken. Interrogations began immediately. Prisoners who had not escaped were rounded up, beaten, and questioned. The SS sought names, planners, accomplices. But the revolt had been carefully compartmentalized. Many knew only fragments of the plan. Even under torture, full details were difficult to extract. The following days brought reprisals. Executions were carried out within the camp. Any suspicion of involvement was treated as guilt. Yet beyond punishment, the SS leadership reached a more unsettling conclusion. Sobibór could no longer function as it had before. A death camp whose prisoners had staged an uprising had lost its most essential feature: secrecy without resistance. Within weeks, orders were issued to dismantle the camp entirely. Buildings were torn down. Barracks were disassembled. The gas chambers were destroyed. Evidence was burned or buried. The area was plowed over and planted with trees to disguise the site. A farmhouse was constructed to suggest ordinary rural life. The Nazis attempted to erase Sobibór not only physically, but from memory. But something irreversible had happened. Out of approximately 600 prisoners in the camp on the day of the revolt, around 300 had broken through the fences. Of those, fewer than 60 would survive the war. Many were captured within days. Others were betrayed, killed by patrols, or died from exposure and exhaustion. Yet survival numbers, though painfully small, do not measure impact alone. The revolt proved that even inside a place designed solely for annihilation, resistance was possible. Those who survived carried testimony with them. They would later describe the layout of the camp, the process of deception, the structure of the killing operations, and the courage of men who had chosen to fight when death was already certain. For the Nazi regime, Sobibór had been part of Operation Reinhard, a machinery of industrial extermination that relied on invisibility. Victims arrived, were killed within hours, and left no trace. The uprising disrupted that design. It forced acknowledgement that the victims were not passive components in a system, but human beings capable of planning, coordination, and defiance. It introduced unpredictability into a system built on rigid control. In the months that followed, Operation Reinhard wound down. Belzec had already been dismantled. Treblinka would close soon after. The machinery of murder shifted forms, but the forests of eastern Poland retained memory. The story of Sobibór's revolt would surface in post-war trials, in survivor accounts, and in historical research that pieced together a camp the Nazis tried to bury beneath soil and silence. The escape did not stop the Holocaust. It did not save most who ran. but it shattered the myth of total obedience inside the extermination camps. It demonstrated that even where survival seemed mathematically impossible, choice remained. Choice to act. Choice to resist. Choice to leave behind witnesses. Tonight, as we move deeper into Sobibór's history, we carry that moment with us. The instant when men who had been reduced to numbers reclaimed their names, their will, and their final act of defiance. The fences fell. The forest opened. And history changed, if only by a breath. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Dismantling a death camp. When the revolt at Sobibór ended, the SS understood something had fundamentally changed. For nearly a year, the camp had operated with terrifying efficiency. Trains arrived. Deception unfolded. Victims were murdered within hours. The forest swallowed the evidence. There were no large prisoner populations, no sprawling barracks of long-term inmates, no visible infrastructure like the larger concentration camps. Sobibór existed for one purpose only: extermination, and it had performed that function with brutal precision. But after October 14, 1943, Sobibór was no longer invisible. An extermination camp where hundreds of prisoners had stormed the gates and escaped could not continue as before. The illusion of perfect control had been shattered. Rumors spread quickly through occupied Poland. Word of the uprising reached underground networks, partisan groups, and even German administrative channels. For the SS leadership, secrecy was not just preference, it was protection. Within days of the revolt, decisions were made. Sobibór would be erased. The order did not simply involve closing the camp. It demanded total physical disappearance. Buildings were dismantled piece by piece. Barracks were torn down. Watchtowers were removed. The gas chambers, the core of the camp's purpose, were destroyed. Any remaining prisoners were executed to eliminate witnesses. The Sonderkommando barracks were emptied. Workshops were cleared. Administrative files were burned. The clearing in the forest, once arranged with deliberate geometric design to maximize control and concealment, was transformed into a landscape of debris and ash. But dismantling Sobibór required more than demolition. It required deception. The Nazis understood that as the war turned against them, Allied investigations into mass murder would eventually follow. Physical proof was dangerous. Warehouses of belongings, cremation pits, structures built for killing. All of it could testify. So the SS ordered the site leveled. Mass graves were opened. Bodies were exhumed and burned on large pyres to destroy forensic evidence. Ash was scattered. Soil was turned over. The terrain was reshaped to conceal unnatural disturbances. The forest that had hidden Sobibór during its operation would now be used to hide its absence. Finally, a farmhouse was constructed on the site. It was meant to suggest ordinary agricultural life, as if nothing extraordinary had ever occurred there. A small settlement, a caretaker, cultivated land. A deliberate attempt to overwrite memory with banality. The men responsible believed that time, combined with physical erasure, would finish the work. Operation Reinhard itself was nearing its end. Belzec had already been dismantled. Treblinka would follow soon after. The extermination of Polish Jewry had reached its horrific completion. Millions were dead. The machinery that killed them began to vanish. But while structures could be destroyed, memory proved more difficult to eliminate. Survivors from Sobibór, though few, carried precise knowledge. They remembered the camp's layout, the ramp where transports arrived, the tube, the narrow fenced path leading to the gas chambers, the sorting barracks where clothing and belongings were divided. They remembered the names of SS officers, the routines of deception, the timing of operations. They remembered the revolt. When Soviet forces advanced into eastern Poland in 1944, they did not find an intact Sobibór. The camp had already been dismantled. Unlike Majdanek, there were no standing gas chambers waiting to be photographed, but absence itself became evidence. The clearing in the forest showed signs of large-scale disturbance. Burned soil, ash layers, unnatural landscaping. Later archaeological investigations would uncover foundations, mass grave sites, and remnants of personal belongings buried beneath the surface. Sobibór had been designed to leave no survivors and no ruins. Yet both survived. The dismantling of the camp marked a shift in Nazi strategy. As defeat loomed, extermination camps were not only sites of murder, they became sites of concealment. The regime attempted to rewrite the physical landscape to match the denial it hoped would follow. But history has a way of resisting burial. Documents from German administrative offices survived. Testimony from guards and collaborators surfaced during post-war trials. Survivors described in detail the mechanisms of death that had operated inside the forest. The revolt itself entered the historical record as proof that Sobibór had not been an anonymous void. Chapter by chapter, investigators reconstructed what the Nazis tried to erase. Sobibór's dismantling tells us something essential about the system that created it. Even those who built extermination camps understood, at some level, that what they had done could not withstand open exposure. They destroyed evidence not because they doubted their ideology, but because they feared judgment. The forest may have grown back. The farmhouse may have stood. But beneath the soil lay a memory too vast to be plowed away. As we continue deeper into Sobibór's history, we turn next to the broader machinery of Operation Reinhard, the network of camps, bureaucrats, railways, and policies that made extermination not just possible but systematic. Sobibór was one piece of that network. Its destruction was an attempt at silence. What remains is testimony. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Operation Reinhard and the machinery behind Sobibór. To understand Sobibór fully, we must step beyond its fences and look at the system that created it. Sobibór was not an isolated experiment. It was one component in a coordinated extermination program known as Operation Reinhard, the deadliest phase of the Holocaust in occupied Poland. Named after Reinhard Heydrich, one of the chief architects of the final solution, this operation was designed with chilling clarity to eliminate the Jewish population of the general government as quickly and efficiently as possible. Unlike concentration camps such as Dachau or Buchenwald, which combined imprisonment, forced labor, and terror, the Operation Reinhard camps were built almost exclusively for killing. Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka formed a triangle of death in eastern Poland. Each was constructed near railway lines. Each was hidden in forests or remote areas. Each was engineered to process transports rapidly and leave almost no survivors. Sobibór's role in this network was specific and calculated. By the time the camp began operations in May 1942, Belzec had already demonstrated that mass murder using gas chambers could be carried out on a scale previously unimaginable. But improvements were constantly sought. The Nazis approached extermination as a logistical problem. How to reduce time, increase capacity, minimize psychological strain on perpetrators, and eliminate evidence. Sobibór became part of that refinement. Transports arrived primarily from ghettos in eastern Poland, but also from the Netherlands, Slovakia, France, and other occupied territories. The victims were told they were being relocated for work. The deception was standardized. Upon arrival, men were separated from women and children. Luggage was tagged for supposed return. Clothing was carefully folded and sorted. Valuables were catalogued and sent to the Reich. Every step was methodical. The tube, the narrow, fenced corridor leading from the undressing area to the gas chambers, was deliberately constructed to prevent visibility. High wooden walls blocked any view of what lay ahead. Guards shouted orders to maintain pace and prevent panic. The victims, already disoriented by travel and fear, were pushed forward with the promise of showers and medical inspection. Inside the gas chambers, carbon monoxide from engine exhaust filled the sealed rooms. Death followed in minutes. The bodies were removed, searched for hidden valuables or gold teeth, and initially buried in mass graves. Later, as part of efforts to conceal evidence, bodies were exhumed and burned on open-air pyres. Ash was crushed and scattered. The system was designed to function like a factory. Trains arrived. Victims were processed. Bodies were disposed of. Personal belongings were shipped away. The camp was cleared for the next transport. At its height, Sobibór could kill thousands of people in a single day. Operation Reinhard as a whole resulted in the murder of approximately 1.7 to 2 million Jews between 1942 and 1943. The speed of the killings was unprecedented. Entire communities vanished within weeks. Ghettos that had been overcrowded and desperate were emptied by rail. Yet this machinery depended not only on SS officers and guards. It relied on railway clerks who scheduled trains, civil administrators who issued orders, accountants who processed confiscated property, industrial planners who redirected stolen goods into the German economy. The Holocaust at Sobibór was not chaotic violence. It was coordinated bureaucracy combined with terror. And this coordination extended across borders. In the Netherlands, Jewish families were deported with official documentation and police supervision. In Slovakia and France, local authorities assisted in arrests and transport arrangements. Victims boarded trains believing, or hoping, that they were being sent to labor camps. Few understood that their destination was a clearing in a Polish forest. Sobibór's design reflected lessons learned from Belzec. Treblinka would refine the process further. The extermination camps were laboratories of efficiency. Guards were trained to maintain distance from the act of killing. Physical barriers prevented direct confrontation with victims' final moments. Alcohol and routine dulled moral resistance among perpetrators. Operation Reinhard also created wealth. Confiscated property, clothing, jewelry, currency, household goods, was shipped to Germany. Gold extracted from teeth was melted down and deposited in Reich accounts. The murder of millions generated material gain for the regime. This convergence of ideology and profit made the system self-reinforcing. Sobibór, in this context, was not merely a killing site. It was a node in a network connected by rails, paperwork, and command structures to a much larger project. The uprising in October 1943 did not only disrupt a single camp. It threatened exposure of the entire network. If one extermination center could be compromised, others might be questioned. The secrecy surrounding Operation Reinhard was vital. The camps were designed to leave no witnesses. But as we have seen, witnesses survived, and their testimonies would later reveal not only what happened inside Sobibór, but how it fit into a broader system of annihilation. In the next segment, we will turn to the human dimension of that system, the lives inside Sobibór beyond the moment of arrival. We will explore the forced labor units, the internal camp hierarchy, the small daily acts of survival, and the fragile threads of resistance that formed long before the revolt erupted. Because even inside a machine built for extermination, human choices continued. And those choices shaped what happened next. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Life inside the machine, the prisoner labor units, and the seeds of revolt. Sobibór was designed to leave no survivors. And yet, for the machinery of extermination to function, a small number of prisoners had to remain alive. These men and women were forced into labor units known as Arbeitsjuden, work Jews, assigned to keep the camp operating. They sorted clothing stripped from the murdered. They cleaned railway platforms. They cut women's hair before gassing. They carried bodies from the gas chambers. They removed gold teeth. They dug mass graves and later exhumed them to burn the evidence. They were not spared out of mercy. They were spared because the system required them. Inside Sobibór, the camp was divided into sections. Camp I contained workshops and barracks for laborers. Camp 2 was the reception and undressing area. Camp 3 was the killing zone, the gas chambers and burial grounds, strictly off-limits to most prisoners except those forced to work there. Very few people who entered Camp 3 survived long. The labor units lived in a state of suspended death. They knew what happened to new arrivals. They saw the smoke. They smelled the burning. They handled the possessions of those who had vanished minutes earlier. Survival depended on usefulness, but usefulness was temporary. Once a worker became weak, ill, or simply unnecessary, they were killed and replaced by the next transport. Turnover was constant. Terror maintained control. Public beatings were routine. Executions were carried out without warning. SS officers and guards used arbitrary violence to remind prisoners of their fragility. One mistake, one hesitation, one perceived defiance could mean death. Yet within this engineered cruelty, something unexpected developed. Communication. Prisoners from different transports shared whispered fragments of information. Dutch Jews spoke to Polish Jews. Slovak deportees exchanged news with Soviet prisoners of war who had been captured and sent to Sobibór. Slowly, a fuller picture emerged. Sobibór was not a transit camp. It was a death camp, and no one was meant to leave alive. This knowledge changed everything. Despair deepened, but so did resolve. In the workshops of Camp I, men repaired boots, tailored uniforms, crafted furniture, and maintained tools. Under the watch of guards, they worked with saws, hammers, and blades. In these spaces, conversations could occur in brief, coded exchanges. Trust had to be measured carefully. Informers could exist. Panic could spread quickly. The first seeds of resistance formed not from grand speeches, but from shared understanding. If we do nothing, we die. This simple truth united individuals from different backgrounds and languages. Among them were Polish Jews who had survived ghettos, Dutch Jews deported from Westerbork, and eventually Soviet Jewish prisoners of war, men with military training who had witnessed frontline brutality. One of them would become central to what followed, Alexander Petchersky. Captured as a Red Army officer and deported to Sobibór in September 1943, Petchersky quickly grasped the camp's function. Unlike many civilians, he carried with him military discipline and experience in organization. He understood hierarchy, timing, and coordinated action. Inside the camp, informal leaders began to connect. Leon Feldhendler, a former member of the Jewish Council in Zalkiuka, had already been considering the possibility of revolt before Petchersky arrived. Feldhendler understood the camp's routines and weaknesses. Petchersky brought the strategic thinking required to act. Together, they formed a fragile alliance. Planning a revolt inside Sobibór required extraordinary caution. Guards patrolled constantly. The camp's layout restricted movement. Weapons were scarce. Any premature attempt would trigger mass execution. The plan that emerged was both daring and precise. Instead of a chaotic uprising, they would lure SS officers into workshops under the pretense of fitting boots or inspecting goods. There, in isolated spaces, they would kill them quietly, one by one. After eliminating key personnel, prisoners would seize the armory, cut telephone lines, and lead a mass escape toward the forest. It was a plan built on timing. And timing was everything. By autumn 1943, Operation Reinhard was nearing completion. Belzec had already been dismantled. Treblinka would soon be shut down. Rumors circulated that Sobibór itself might be liquidated. The labor units understood what that meant. Once their work was done, they too would be killed. There was no future inside the fence. On October 14, 1943, the plan was set in motion. But before that day arrived, something remarkable occurred inside Sobibór's brutal confines. Human solidarity. Men who had been forced to carry bodies shared crumbs of bread. Women who sorted clothing smuggled small tools. Prisoners risked immediate death to pass messages between barracks. Fear did not disappear, it deepened, but it was reshaped into action. Not everyone agreed. Some feared retaliation. Others doubted success. Many simply could not believe that escape from a death camp was possible. Yet as transports slowed and tension increased, the logic became undeniable. Die passively in the gas chamber, or risk everything in revolt. Inside a camp designed to extinguish identity, choice returned. The guards noticed nothing. Routine masked preparation. SS officers continued their inspections. Ukrainian auxiliaries manned towers as usual. The machinery of extermination operated normally. No one suspected that the laborers they had beaten and starved were preparing something unprecedented. The revolt would not destroy Sobibór immediately, but it would shatter its secrecy. In the next chapter, we will walk through the day of October 14, 1943, hour by hour, as the prisoners executed their plan, killed several SS officers, and launched one of the only successful uprisings inside a Nazi extermination camp. Because Sobibór was built to erase all witnesses. And on that day, the witnesses fought back. Chapter 5, Segment 1. October 14, 1943, the day Sobibór broke. The morning began like every other. Cold mist hung low over the sandy clearing. The watchtowers stood silent, their shadows stretching across the barbed wire. Guards shouted orders. Prisoners lined up for roll call. Boots crunched against gravel. Nothing seemed different, and that was the point. Inside the barracks, men avoided eye contact. Instructions had already been whispered the night before. There would be no speeches, no dramatic signals. Each person involved knew only what they needed to know. Timing was everything. Silence was survival. Alexander Petchersky moved calmly among the prisoners. He could not afford to show fear. Neither could Leon Feldhendler. Around them, selected members of the underground waited for specific assignments. The plan depended on deception. Individual SS officers would be summoned to workshops under harmless pretenses. A new pair of boots had arrived. A leather coat required adjustment. A piece of furniture was ready for inspection. Each invitation had to sound ordinary. Routine was the disguise. Shortly before 4 in the afternoon, the first step began. SS Oberscharfer Joseph Wolf was called to the tailor's shop to try on a coat. Inside the narrow room, prisoners stood ready. When Wolf removed his weapon belt and leaned toward a mirror, an axe struck him from behind. The blow was swift, silent, and final. His body was dragged away and hidden beneath fabric. Minutes later, another officer entered a different workshop. This pattern repeated itself. In the shoemaker's shop, SS Oberscharfer Siegfried Gretschus arrived expecting new boots. He was attacked and killed. In the carpenter's shop, SS Untersturmführer Johann Niemann, one of the highest-ranking officers present in the camp that day, was lured inside and struck down. Each killing was precise. No gunshots, no alarms. For nearly an hour, the illusion held. Guards disappeared one by one, summoned by polite requests and met with concealed blades, axes, and stolen knives. Prisoners working nearby strained to keep their breathing steady. Any scream, any raised voice could end everything. By 5 o'clock, several key SS officers were dead. But the plan was unraveling faster than expected. Not every target appeared. Some guards remained at their posts. Others became suspicious when officers failed to return. The underground had hoped to seize the armory quietly, distribute weapons, and then assemble prisoners in formation before marching toward the main gate. That part failed. When a Ukrainian guard stumbled upon one of the bodies, the alarm was triggered earlier than planned. Shots rang out. Confusion erupted. The moment for subtlety was gone. Petrsky understood immediately. The uprising had to begin now. A whistle pierced the air. Not official, not orderly, but desperate. Prisoners began running toward the camp's perimeter. Some grabbed axes and tools. Others rushed the main gate. A group attempted to reach the armory but found it heavily guarded. Gunfire exploded from watchtowers. Men and women sprinted across open ground. Barbed wire fences tore clothing and skin. Some attempted to climb over. Others searched frantically for weak points. A few discovered a section where the fence had not yet been fully reinforced. Then came the mines. Unknown to many prisoners, the outer perimeter beyond the fence was surrounded by a minefield. The first escapees detonated explosions that shook the forest. Bodies fell. Smoke rose. Screams cut through the air. Yet they kept running. Hundreds of prisoners surged toward the woods beyond the camp. Guards fired wildly. Some Ukrainian auxiliaries fled. Others attempted to regroup. Chaos replaced order. Inside Sobibór, the machinery of death had collapsed into confusion. Of the approximately 600 prisoners in the camp that day, around 300 managed to break through the perimeter and reach the forest. Many were shot during the attempt. Others were killed by mines. Still others would later be hunted down in the surrounding countryside. But something irreversible had happened. Sobibór had been exposed. For the first time, prisoners had not walked quietly toward gas chambers. They had turned their tools into weapons. They had transformed obedience into defiance. Inside the camp, the remaining SS and guards scrambled to reassert control. Prisoners who had not participated, or who had been unable to escape, faced immediate execution. The camp grounds were littered with bodies, both prisoners and guards. The revolt had lasted less than an hour. Yet in that hour, Sobibór changed forever. In the forest, scattered groups of escapees struggled to orient themselves. They had no maps, no supplies, and no guarantee of help from local populations. Some would find partisan units. Others would be betrayed. Many would die in the following days. But some survived. Their survival would become testimony. Back inside Sobibór, the SS leadership faced a new problem. The camp's secrecy had been shattered. A mass escape from an extermination camp could not be ignored. News would spread. Investigations might follow. Operation Reinhard was already nearing completion. The decision was swift. Sobibór would be dismantled. In the next segment, we will follow the aftermath, the manhunt through the forests, the dismantling of the camp, and how the Nazis attempted to erase Sobibór from the earth, unaware that survivors were already carrying its story beyond the barbed wire. Chapter 5, Segment 2. The Hunt in the Forest. Night fell quickly over the woods beyond Sobibór. The forest that had promised freedom now became something far more uncertain. The prisoners who had broken through the fences were scattered in every direction. Some in small groups, others alone, breath burning in their lungs, hearts pounding with the shock of sudden survival. Behind them, the camp was still echoing with gunfire. The SS and Ukrainian guards regrouped within hours. Orders were issued. Search parties were formed. Local police units were alerted. The surrounding villages were warned that escaped prisoners were dangerous criminals. Rewards were offered for information. The forest became a trap. For the escapees, the first challenge was immediate and brutal: distance. Many had fled without food, without coats, without any real sense of direction. Some were still wearing thin camp clothing, marked with stripes that made concealment difficult. It was October in eastern Poland. The nights were cold. The ground was damp. Rain began to fall. Small groups attempted to stay together, believing numbers offered protection. Others chose to separate, hoping to reduce visibility. Alexander Petrovsky's group moved cautiously, heading deeper into wooded terrain, guided by instinct and faint knowledge of the region. Leon Feldhendler and others took different paths. Fear traveled with them. Every snapped twig could signal pursuit. Every distant bark of a dog might mean tracking units were close. The SS deployed dogs and organized coordinated sweeps through the undergrowth. Gunshots echoed sporadically through the trees. Within days, dozens of escapees were captured or killed. Some were discovered hiding in barns or haystacks. Others were betrayed by locals terrified of German retaliation. In some villages, frightened civilians reported suspicious strangers immediately. In others, a few courageous families offered bread, shelter, or directions, acts that risked execution. The forest did not discriminate between bravery and exhaustion. Hunger set in quickly. Water had to be found in streams. Movement during daylight was dangerous. Many traveled only at night, stumbling through uneven ground. Some injured themselves during the initial escape. Cuts from barbed wire, wounds from bullets, shrapnel from mines. Without medical care, infections spread. One group wandered for days before encountering partisans, armed resistance fighters operating in the region. Not all partisans were welcoming. Some groups distrusted unfamiliar faces. Others demanded proof of loyalty or weapons in exchange for acceptance. Yet a handful of Sobibór survivors joined partisan units and continued the fight against the German occupation. For others, survival meant invisibility. They shaved their heads to remove recognizable features. They scavenged civilian clothing when possible. They memorized false names and stories in case of questioning. They learned to move without leaving tracks. By late October, the organized manhunt intensified. German forces scoured the countryside in widening circles. Public notices warned that aiding escapees would result in immediate execution. Entire villages were threatened. Some local inhabitants, fearing collective punishment, chose cooperation over compassion. One by one, the number of survivors diminished. Out of the roughly 300 who had reached the forest, it is estimated that fewer than 100 would survive the war. But survival was not only measured in numbers. Every person who escaped carried knowledge. They knew how Sobibór functioned. They knew about the gas chambers, the deception, the trains arriving from across Europe. They had seen the structure of the camp. They could describe the layout of the killing areas. They could name SS officers. They had witnessed murder at an industrial scale. The Nazis understood this danger. Back inside Sobibór, the leadership faced an unavoidable conclusion. The camp's secrecy was compromised beyond repair. Heinrich Himmler had always intended Operation Reinhard to leave as little trace as possible. Belzec and Treblinka had already been dismantled. Now Sobibór had proven that prisoners could resist, and that some could escape. The decision came swiftly. Sobibór would cease operations. The remaining prisoners inside the camp, those who had not escaped and were deemed unnecessary, were executed in the days following the revolt. The camp's infrastructure began to be dismantled piece by piece. Buildings were taken apart. Materials were removed. The gas chambers were destroyed. Foundations were leveled. Prisoners from other camps were forced to assist in erasing the evidence. When their work was complete, they too were killed. Trees were planted over the site. A farmhouse was constructed to disguise the land. A Ukrainian guard was assigned to live there with his family, creating the appearance of ordinary rural life. The Nazis believed they had restored silence, but the forest had already broken it. In the months and years that followed, survivors who reached safety began to tell their stories. Some testified to Soviet investigators. Others would speak after the war in Poland, Israel, the United States. Their accounts would become crucial evidence in reconstructing what had happened at Sobibór. Without the revolt, there might have been no witnesses at all. The uprising had not saved everyone. It had not stopped the Holocaust, but it had shattered the illusion that the extermination camps were impenetrable machines. In the next segment, we will examine how Sobibór was dismantled, how the Nazis attempted to erase it from history, and how post-war investigations slowly uncovered the truth hidden beneath the forest floor. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Erasing the camp and the silence that followed. After the revolt, Sobibór was no longer simply a killing center. It had become a liability. For nearly a year and a half, the camp had operated in near-total secrecy. Trains arrived. Victims disappeared. Very few lived long enough to describe what had happened behind the barbed wire. The system depended on silence, and on the belief that no one would ever return to speak. October 14, 1943, shattered that belief. Even though most escapees were hunted down in the forests, enough survived to make one fact unavoidable. Sobibór had been seen from the inside. The layout, the gas chambers, the deception, the machinery of death was no longer completely hidden. The SS leadership acted quickly. Within days of the revolt, orders were issued to dismantle the camp entirely. There would be no reopening, no reconstruction. Sobibór would be erased. The remaining prisoners, those who had not escaped and were still alive after the chaos, were killed. Some were shot in small groups. Others were taken away under pretense and executed. No one who had worked in the extermination process was meant to survive. The dismantling began methodically. Barracks were torn down plank by plank. Watchtowers were disassembled. The fences were removed. The gas chambers, the heart of the killing operation, were demolished. Concrete foundations were broken apart. Mass graves, where possible, had already been exhumed during earlier cleansing operations. Corpses were burned on open-air pyres in an attempt to destroy forensic evidence. This process of exhumation and burning had begun months earlier as part of a broader operation ordered by Heinrich Himmler, Action 1005, intended to eliminate proof of mass murder across occupied territories. Sobibór had participated in this grim work even before the revolt. But now the destruction became total. When the buildings were gone, the land itself was reshaped. Earth was leveled. Trenches were filled. Trees were planted across the site to mask irregular ground. The SS sought to turn a place of extermination into a patch of ordinary forest. To complete the illusion, a farmhouse was built on the former campgrounds. A Ukrainian guard and his family were installed there, creating the appearance that the land had always been agricultural. The Nazis believed this would close the chapter. No buildings.
No prisoners. No visible graves.
No records left behind that could tell the full story. Sobibór would vanish. For a time, it nearly did. As the war continued, attention shifted to larger battles and advancing armies. The Red Army pushed westward. The Western Allies prepared for invasion. The destruction of one remote camp seemed small within the vast catastrophe unfolding across Europe. When the region was liberated, investigators found little at first glance. No standing gas chambers.
No intact crematoria.
Just disturbed soil, scattered debris, and fragments of barbed wire. Without survivors, the site might have remained an indistinct clearing in the woods. But survivors did exist. Alexander Petchersky survived the war in the Soviet Union. Others, though few, endured hiding, partisan fighting, or displacement. After the war, they began to testify. Their accounts were specific. They described the ramp where trains arrived. They explained the division between Camp I, Camp II, and Camp III. They recalled the narrow, camouflaged pathway, the tube, that led to the gas chambers. They identified SS officers by name. They recounted the uprising in careful detail. For the first time, Sobibór emerged from rumor into documented history. Post-war trials would bring some of the perpetrators to justice. In the 1960s, West Germany prosecuted former Sobibór guards in what became known as the Sobibór trial. Testimonies from survivors formed the backbone of the case. The camp that had been intended to leave no witnesses was now reconstructed through memory. Archaeology would later confirm what testimony described. Excavations uncovered foundations of gas chambers, personal belongings buried in the soil, and remnants of the camp's layout. The forest had hidden the crime, but it had not erased it. Sobibór had been designed for disappearance. Unlike Auschwitz, it was never meant to stand as a vast industrial complex with thousands of laborers. It was small, efficient, and temporary, a factory built solely to kill and then vanish. That was its purpose within Operation Reinhard. Speed, secrecy, erasure. Between 1942 and 1943, approximately 170,000 to 250,000 people were murdered there. Primarily Jews from Poland, the Netherlands, Slovakia, France, and other occupied territories. Almost all were killed within hours of arrival. And then the place itself was wiped away. But memory does not obey demolition orders. The revolt ensured that Sobibór would not become an empty rumor. It created witnesses, provided names, forced acknowledgement. In the broader history of the Holocaust, Sobibór stands as both a symbol of annihilation and of defiance. It demonstrates how the machinery of genocide relied not only on violence, but on concealment, and how even one fracture in that concealment could echo across decades. In the next chapter, we will step back to examine Sobibór's place within Operation Reinhard, how it fit into the larger network of Belzec and Treblinka, and how together they formed one of the most lethal phases of the Holocaust. Chapter 6, Segment 1. Operation Reinhard, the Network of Extermination. Sobibór did not exist alone. It was one part of something larger, a coordinated system of death designed not for imprisonment, not for forced labor, but for rapid and total extermination. The name given to this system was Operation Reinhard. Launched in 1942 under the authority of SS leadership in occupied Poland, Operation Reinhard was the plan to murder the Jews of the general government, the central region of occupied Poland, and eventually Jews deported from across Europe. It was not improvised chaos. It was organized, budgeted, scheduled. 3 primary camps formed its core: Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka. Each was constructed with a singular purpose: to kill efficiently and to leave as little trace as possible. Belzec was the first. It began operations in March 1942. Lessons learned there about deception, transport logistics, gas chamber construction, and corpse disposal were applied to Sobibór, which began killing in May 1942. Treblinka followed in July, becoming the largest and deadliest of the 3. Together, these camps murdered approximately 1.5 to 2 million people in less than 2 years. Unlike Auschwitz-Birkenau, which combined forced labor with extermination and grew into a vast complex, the Reinhard camps were smaller and more focused. They were built near railway lines but hidden in remote wooded areas. Their layouts were compact. Victims were processed quickly. Very few were selected for labor. Almost everyone who arrived was dead within hours. The efficiency was intentional. Transports were scheduled through the German rail system like freight shipments. Deportation lists were compiled by bureaucrats. Confiscated belongings were sorted, catalogued, and shipped back into the German economy. Gold teeth were extracted and melted. Hair was collected. Clothing was reused or sold. Murder was integrated into administration. At the center of Operation Reinhard stood SS and police leader Odilo Globoknik, based in Lublin. Under his supervision, a small cadre of SS officers, many of whom had previously participated in the T4 euthanasia program inside Germany, applied their experience with gassing techniques to mass extermination on an unprecedented scale. Christian Wirth, Franz Stangl, and other administrators moved between camps, refining procedures. How many victims could be processed in a day? How quickly could transports be unloaded? How should gas chambers be constructed for maximum throughput? How could deception be maintained until the final moment? These were logistical questions, answered with chilling precision. The Reinhard camps shared key features. Each had a reception area designed to create a false sense of normalcy. Signs pointed toward bathhouses. Guards used calm, reassuring language. Prisoners were instructed to undress and remember where they placed their belongings. Then came the tube, a fenced and camouflaged pathway leading to the gas chambers. In Belzec and Sobibór, gas chambers initially used carbon monoxide from engine exhaust. Later, Treblinka expanded and improved chamber capacity. The method differed slightly from Auschwitz's Zyklon B system, but the outcome was the same. Bodies were first buried in mass graves. As the graves filled and decomposition became a problem, they were later exhumed and burned in open-air cremation pits, part of efforts to reduce evidence. Operation Reinhard was not merely about killing individuals. It was about emptying entire regions. Ghettos across Poland, Warsaw, Lublin, Krakow, and countless smaller towns were liquidated. Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed within months. Trains ran constantly. The speed of the operation was staggering. In some periods during 1942, tens of thousands were murdered each week. Sobibór's role within this network was specific. It primarily received transports from eastern Poland and later from Western Europe, especially the Netherlands. Dutch Jews deported via Westerbork arrived believing they were being sent to labor camps in the east. Instead, they stepped into a killing center. Operation Reinhard also included economic plunder on a vast scale. Confiscated property, cash, jewelry, and foreign currency were funneled into SS accounts. The operation generated enormous profits for the regime, making genocide financially self-sustaining. This combination of ideology, logistics, and profit defined the operation. And yet, despite its scope, Operation Reinhard remained secretive. Its camps were temporary. Their staff numbers were relatively small, often fewer than 100 German SS men per camp, supported by several hundred trained auxiliaries. A small group oversaw mass death. By late 1943, however, the operation began to wind down. Most of the Jewish population in occupied Poland had already been murdered. Resistance uprisings, including Sobibór in October and Treblinka in August, exposed vulnerabilities. The advancing Soviet army threatened exposure. Belzec had already been dismantled. Sobibór followed after the revolt. Treblinka would be erased soon after. Operation Reinhard was declared complete in November 1943. The camps were leveled. Files were destroyed. Personnel were reassigned to other duties, including anti-partisan operations and later service in Italy. But the impact could not be undone. Entire communities had vanished. In the next segment, we will examine more closely the human dimension within this system, the prisoners forced to assist in the killing process, the Sonderkommando units, and the impossible moral landscape inside a camp designed solely for death. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Inside the machine, the Sonderkommando, and the mechanics of death. To understand Sobibór fully, we must look not only at those who were murdered there, but at those who were forced to keep the machinery of death running. Inside the camp existed a small, constantly rotating group of prisoners known as the Sonderkommando, special work details assigned to the most horrific tasks. These men were not collaborators by choice. They were captives selected upon arrival, spared immediate death only because their labor was required. Their survival was temporary. Their role was essential. When a transport arrived, chaos followed. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, stepped off the train disoriented and terrified. SS officers barked orders. Guards shouted in German and Polish. Prisoners selected for labor were separated quickly. Tailors, barbers, cobblers, carpenters, anyone with a skill that could be exploited. Most were driven forward. The Sonderkommando were responsible for receiving the victims after the gas chambers had done their work. When the doors were opened, the bodies were tightly packed, often entangled, contorted, and covered in sweat, vomit, and human waste. Carbon monoxide left faces discolored, limbs stiff. The men assigned to this task had to untangle them. They pulled bodies from the chambers, carried them to burial pits, later to cremation pyres. They searched clothing for valuables. Gold teeth were extracted under supervision. Hair was cut from women before gassing. The pace was relentless. Each detail was observed by guards. Brutality ensured obedience. These prisoners lived in isolation from other inmates. They understood clearly that their knowledge made them dangerous to the SS. To leave witnesses alive was unacceptable. Periodically, Sonderkommando units were executed and replaced with new arrivals, ensuring that few survived long enough to testify. Yet even within this forced complicity, small acts of resistance occurred. Some whispered warnings to newcomers when possible, though such attempts were almost always silenced. Others slowed their work in subtle ways. A few memorized details, layouts, routines, guard shifts, information that would later prove crucial during the revolt. Sobibór's layout was divided into sections. The reception area, the administrative zone, the barracks, and Camp 3, the extermination area, where gas chambers and burial pits were located. Camp 3 was off-limits to most prisoners. Those assigned there lived under constant threat. Guards often killed them without explanation, reinforcing the understanding that they were expendable. The killing process itself followed a rigid pattern. Victims were told they would be disinfected before work assignments. They were ordered to undress in a designated yard. Belongings were stacked neatly, shoes placed together, clothing folded. Then they were driven through the camouflaged pathway known as the tube. The gas chambers were small, concrete structures disguised as bathhouses. Engine exhaust was funneled inside. Within minutes, oxygen thinned. Panic turned to suffocation. Silence followed. The Sonderkommando waited. They learned to recognize the exact moment when it was safe to open the doors. Too early meant exposure to toxic fumes. Too late meant falling behind schedule. This routine repeated day after day, thousands per week. It is difficult to comprehend how human beings endured such a role. Survivor testimony later described numbness, a psychological shutdown necessary to survive even a few weeks in that position. Some men lost the ability to speak. Others moved mechanically, eyes unfocused. They lived with the knowledge that their own execution was inevitable. Outside Camp 3, other prisoners labored in sorting barracks, warehouses, workshops. Clothing taken from victims was cleaned and repackaged. Suitcases were examined for valuables. Personal letters were destroyed. Murder was industrial but also intimate. Every pair of shoes once belonged to someone. Every coat held a name, a story. As Operation Reinhard intensified, transports increased. Sobibór processed Jews from Poland, the Netherlands, Slovakia, France, and even Belarus. The Dutch transports in particular shocked the prisoners. Families arrived neatly dressed, carrying labeled luggage. Many still believed they were heading to labor settlements. The deception worked, at least until the final moments. Within this environment, rumors began to circulate. Prisoners who had been transferred from other camps spoke of Belzec and Treblinka. They compared notes. They realized that survival through obedience was an illusion. By mid-1943, it became clear to many inside Sobibór that the camp's future would not include them. After the majority of Polish Jews had been murdered, the SS began dismantling Belzec. Whispers spread. Once Sobibór's work was complete, the camp itself might disappear, and its prisoners with it. For the Sonderkommando and others forced to witness everything, this realization created a turning point. Death was certain, whether today or in a few months. The only question was how. In the next segment, we will examine how this understanding gave rise to something unexpected. A plan born inside a death camp, designed not just to survive but to strike back. Chapter 6, Segment 3. The breaking point, when survival was no longer enough. By late summer of 1943, something inside Sobibór had shifted. The camp still functioned. Transports still arrived. The gas chambers still operated with brutal efficiency. Guards still shouted. Engines still roared. Smoke still drifted above the trees. But among the prisoners, silence was no longer empty. It was calculating. For nearly 2 years, Sobibór had been a place designed to erase hope. Resistance seemed impossible. The camp was isolated deep in forest. Barbed wire was laced with mines. Watchtowers stood at every corner. Ukrainian guards patrolled constantly. Anyone caught attempting escape was executed, often publicly, as a warning. And yet, despite all of this, a quiet understanding began to spread. Obedience would not save them. The SS had begun dismantling Belzec earlier that year. Survivors transferred through Sobibór whispered what they had seen. Burial pits opened, bodies burned, buildings torn down, trees planted over mass graves. The camp erased, the prisoners killed. If Belzec could vanish, Sobibór could too. The realization hardened into certainty. When the work was done, no witnesses would remain. For many prisoners, especially those assigned to Camp I and Camp II, this knowledge transformed fear into resolve. Survival alone was no longer the goal. There had to be something more, something that would leave evidence behind, something that would prove the camp had existed. The first escape attempts were desperate and uncoordinated. Individuals ran for the fences, hoping confusion might buy seconds. Most were shot before reaching the perimeter. Others triggered mines. Their bodies were left hanging as warnings. But each failed attempt carried a lesson. Guards rotated at predictable times. Certain SS officers followed routines. Workshops provided access to tools. The telephone lines connecting Sobibór to nearby command posts ran above ground in certain places. Information began to circulate in whispers, during work assignments, in the barracks at night, while carrying supplies between sectors. Then, in September 1943, a new transport arrived. Among the prisoners selected for labor were Soviet Jewish soldiers, captured Red Army officers. They were different. They had military training. They understood strategy, coordination, timing. One of them was Lieutenant Alexander Pechersky. Pechersky quickly grasped the reality of Sobibór. Within days, he connected with existing prisoner organizers, including Leon Feldhendler, who had already been considering a plan. Together, they began discussing something unprecedented. Not escape for one or two, but revolt. The challenge was immense. The camp housed around 600 prisoners. The guards were armed and trained. There were no external allies nearby. Any uprising would likely be crushed within minutes. But the alternative was certain death. The plan they developed was careful, methodical, and built on deception, just as the camp itself was built on deception. They would not charge the gates. They would eliminate the SS officers one by one. Using the workshops as bait, prisoners would invite specific officers inside under pretense. A new coat to try on, boots to be fitted, valuables to inspect. Hidden axes and knives would be used. Silence would be essential. Bodies would be concealed temporarily. If enough officers could be killed quietly, chaos might give prisoners the chance to reach the main gate and fences together. The plan required coordination across barracks, across language barriers, across fear. It also required secrecy. Only a small inner circle knew the full details. If even one person betrayed them, under torture or out of desperation, the consequences would be catastrophic. For weeks, preparations continued quietly. Tools were sharpened, schedules memorized, trust tested. Meanwhile, daily life in Sobibór continued as always. Transports arrived. Gas chambers operated. The forest absorbed the smoke. The SS sensed nothing. On the surface, prisoners remained obedient, exhausted, broken. But beneath that surface, something new was forming. Not hope in survival, but determination in action. October approached. The chosen day would have to coincide with favorable conditions. Enough officers present to make an impact, but not so many that resistance would be overwhelmed immediately. Ukrainian guards stationed in towers posed an additional threat. They would likely begin shooting at the first sign of disorder. Speed would be critical. There would be no second chance. In the barracks at night, men lay awake staring into darkness, knowing that within days they might either die in the attempt, or die anyway when the camp was erased. Some wrote brief notes and hid them beneath floorboards. Others shared bread with friends, quiet acknowledgments of what might come. No one imagined all would survive. That was never the objective. The objective was to prove that Sobibór was not invincible, that even inside a death camp, resistance could exist. In the next chapter, we will witness the revolt itself, how it unfolded, how it fractured, how prisoners ran through minefields and gunfire, and how Sobibór, for a single afternoon, lost control of the terror it had perfected. Chapter 7, Segment 1. October 14, 1943, the revolt begins. The morning of October 14, 1943, began like every other day in Sobibór. The whistle blew before dawn. Prisoners rose from wooden bunks. Thin blankets were folded. Faces hollow with hunger turned toward another day of labor. Guards shouted commands. Roll call followed. Names were never called, only numbers counted. Nothing appeared different. But beneath the routine, tension moved like an electrical current. This was the day. For weeks, a small group of prisoners had prepared in silence. Axes had been hidden in workshops. Knives concealed beneath clothing. Roles assigned. Timings memorized. Each man involved understood that discovery meant immediate execution, not only for him but for dozens of others. And yet no one betrayed the plan. The revolt was scheduled to begin in the afternoon, when work assignments would allow individual SS officers to be isolated inside workshops. The strategy was simple and terrifying in its precision. Lure them in one by one, kill them quietly, hide the bodies, and wait until enough of the camp's leadership had been eliminated to create confusion. There would be no gunfire at first, only axes. The first target was SS Oberscharfer Joseph Wolf, known for his cruelty. He was told that a new leather coat had arrived, one worth examining. He entered the tailor's workshop alone. The door closed behind him. Inside, prisoners stood waiting. There was no speech.
No declaración.
Just a sudden swing of an axe. Wolf fell without a shout. His body was dragged behind fabric and clothing racks. The blood was wiped as quickly as possible. Outside, the camp continued its rhythm. Guards paced. Prisoners carried lumber. Smoke drifted from the direction of Camp 3. Minutes later, another officer was summoned. This time for boots. SS Oberscharfer Siegfried Gretschus entered the shoemaker's workshop. He had no reason to suspect danger. Prisoners had been conditioned to obedience for nearly 2 years. Fear was routine. Inside, he was struck from behind. Another body hidden. Another silence maintained. The plan unfolded with frightening efficiency. SS officers were invited one at a time, for new uniforms, for fittings, for supplies. Each entered expecting compliance. Each was met with concealed weapons and desperate resolve. Axes thudded against bone. Knives flashed. Breath was held to prevent screams. In less than 2 hours, several key SS personnel lay dead inside their own camp. But no plan survives perfectly. One officer failed to appear at the appointed time. Another guard noticed something unusual, perhaps a door closed too long, perhaps the absence of a superior. Suspicion began to ripple outward. Meanwhile, word of the revolt spread among prisoners not originally included in the inner circle. Fear and confusion mixed with anticipation. Some understood immediately what was happening. Others were terrified. The signal to gather was approaching. At approximately 4 p.m., prisoners were called toward the roll call square under the pretense of routine assembly. The expectation was that, by then, enough SS officers would be eliminated to allow a coordinated rush toward the main gate. But time was running short. A shot rang out. Whether accidental or triggered by discovery, it shattered the silence the organizers had worked so carefully to maintain. Chaos erupted instantly. Ukrainian guards in watchtowers raised their rifles. Sirens began to wail. Prisoners realized the element of surprise was collapsing. Alexander Petchersky stepped forward and shouted what had been rehearsed but never spoken aloud. "Comrades, the day has come. Most of the Germans are dead. Let us die with honor." The words cut through the panic. Hundreds of prisoners surged toward the front gate. Some tried to seize weapons from fallen guards. Others grabbed tools, hammers, axes, anything available. A few Ukrainian guards fled. Others opened fire directly into the crowd. Bullets tore through bodies. Men fell, and those behind them stumbled forward over the fallen. The main gate proved heavily guarded. Instead, many prisoners veered toward the perimeter fence, barbed wire laced with hidden mines. There was no time to clear paths. The first men reached the wire and began climbing. Explosions followed. Mines detonated beneath desperate feet. Shrapnel tore through flesh. The fence shook as bodies hit it. Some prisoners used corpses to shield themselves from further blasts, scrambling over broken wire while gunfire rained from towers. The forest beyond the fence, once a barrier, now represented the only possibility of survival. Some reached it, others did not. Within minutes, the camp yard became a battlefield. Smoke, screams, gunfire, detonations. The careful, silent revolt had transformed into open insurrection. Approximately 600 prisoners had lived in Sobibór that morning. By nightfall, hundreds lay dead inside the perimeter, shot, blown apart by mines, or killed during the initial chaos. But roughly 300 had broken through. They ran into the forest in scattered groups. Some wounded, many unarmed, all exhausted behind them. Sobibór burned with confusion. The SS had not expected this. For the first time in its existence, the camp had lost control. In the next segment, we will follow those who escaped into the woods, how many survived the hunt that followed, and how the revolt forced the Nazis to dismantle Sobibór entirely. Chapter 7, Segment 2. Into the Forest, Escape, Hunt, and Survival. By nightfall on October 14, 1943, Sobibór was no longer silent. Gunfire echoed beyond the perimeter fence. Smoke drifted through the trees. Sirens and shouted orders blended with the fading cries of the wounded. Inside the camp, Bodies lay scattered across the roll call square and tangled in broken barbed wire. Mines had exploded in violent bursts, tearing apart the desperate rush toward freedom. But beyond the wire, beyond the final line of control, nearly 300 prisoners had made it into the forest. They did not run as a single group. They scattered. Some fled alone. Others clung to small clusters of 3 or 4. A few remained with Alexander Petchersky, instinctively drawn to leadership in the chaos. No one had maps. No one had supplies. Most were weak from months of starvation and forced labor. Many were wounded by gunfire or shrapnel. The forest was dark.
Bransje store at striped uniforms.
Roots tripped bare, blistered feet. Breath came in ragged bursts. Some men collapsed within minutes, too exhausted to continue. Others carried the injured as far as they could before being forced to make impossible decisions. Stay and risk capture, or leave and survive. Behind them, the SS regrouped quickly. Searchlights pierced the trees. Dogs were released. Ukrainian auxiliaries formed patrol lines. Orders were given with urgency that had rarely existed inside Sobibór's walls. This was not merely a prison break. This was humiliation. An extermination camp had revolted. That could not be allowed to stand. Within hours, the surrounding countryside was placed on alert. German forces notified local authorities. Roadblocks were established. Rewards were offered for information. Farmers were warned that harboring fugitives would bring severe punishment. The forest became a trap. The first captures happened quickly. Some escapees, weakened and disoriented, wandered onto open roads and were spotted immediately. Others were betrayed by villagers who feared reprisals. Several were hunted down by search parties guided by barking dogs. Gunshots punctuated the night. By morning, the number of living escapees had already fallen. Yet others pressed deeper into the wilderness. They moved cautiously now, avoiding paths, traveling only at night, drinking from streams. Hunger became immediate and sharp. For months, their bodies had survived on starvation rations. Now there was nothing. Leaves were chewed, bark scraped, muddy water swallowed. Among the escapees were men who had been tailors, carpenters, clerks, ordinary civilians before deportation. Now they navigated forests like fugitives in hostile territory. And among them were Soviet prisoners of war who understood survival differently. Alexander Petchersky, a former Red Army officer, urged small groups to organize rather than wander aimlessly. He knew that isolation meant vulnerability, but fear fractured cohesion. Some believed larger groups would be easier to detect. Others feared betrayal. Within days, the scattered fugitives faced another danger: local hostility. In some areas, Polish partisans provided limited assistance, food, directions, sometimes shelter. In other places, anti-Semitism and fear led to denunciations. The landscape beyond Sobibór was not a simple refuge. It was unpredictable terrain shaped by occupation, suspicion, and desperation. Some escapees attempted to join partisan units fighting German forces. A few succeeded. Others were turned away. For Jewish fugitives, survival required invisibility. Clothing had to be changed, identities altered, papers forged or stolen. All of this demanded resources they did not possess. The search intensified over the following weeks.
SS Patrol combat de village.
Rewards were advertised publicly. Anyone caught aiding escapees faced execution. The number of survivors dwindled steadily. Some were executed in public as warnings. Others disappeared into forests permanently, presumed dead. By the end of 1943, only a fraction of the original escapees remained alive. Historians estimate that of the roughly 300 who broke through Sobibór's fences that day, Fewer than 60 would survive the war. 60 out of 600 who had woken that morning inside the camp. Yet those 60 changed history, because Sobibór had never been meant to produce witnesses. It was designed for total erasure. The revolt shattered that intention. News of the uprising spread rapidly within German administrative circles. Reports traveled up the chain of command. Heinrich Himmler himself received confirmation that an extermination camp had experienced armed resistance and mass escape. The decision that followed was immediate. Sobibór would be dismantled. The killing operations ceased shortly after the revolt. Remaining prisoners were executed. Buildings were torn down. Gas chambers demolished. Barracks dismantled. The ground was plowed and planted with crops to conceal the evidence. A farmhouse was constructed on the site. Guards were reassigned. Officially, Sobibór would vanish. But the forest remembered. And so did the survivors. Those who lived carried the memory of what they had seen inside Camp 3. The deception, the gas chambers, the piles of belongings, the smell of death. Without the revolt, Sobibór might have disappeared entirely from historical record, reduced to rumors and fragments. Instead, testimony survived. In the next segment, we will examine the aftermath of the revolt, how Sobibór was erased, how the surviving witnesses told their stories, and how justice was pursued in the decades that followed. Chapter 7, Segment 3. Erasing the Camp Memory Against Oblivion. When the last gunshots faded in the forests around Sobibór, the SS understood something had changed forever. An extermination camp, designed for silence, had produced witnesses. That fact alone made Sobibór dangerous. Within days of the revolt, Heinrich Himmler ordered the camp dismantled. Killing operations were halted. The remaining Jewish prisoners, those too weak or uninvolved in the uprising, were executed. Guards combed through barracks and storage huts, collecting documents, burning records, removing any trace of organized murder. Gas chambers were torn down. Wooden structures were dismantled plank by plank. Mass graves were reopened. Corpses were exhumed and burned on open-air pyres in a final attempt to eliminate physical evidence. Ash was scattered. The earth was leveled. The Nazis had practiced this before. Belzec had already been dismantled. Treblinka would follow. Operation Reinhard camps were not meant to stand as monuments. They were meant to function briefly and then disappear. At Sobibór, trees were planted across the flattened ground. A farmhouse was built near the former camp perimeter. A Ukrainian guard was stationed there with his family to maintain the illusion of ordinary rural life. By early 1944, Sobibór no longer existed, at least on maps. But it lived in memory. The survivors who escaped carried with them something more powerful than documents: testimony. They carried the knowledge of how the camp operated, the layout, the deception, the names of guards, the rhythm of transports, the sounds from Camp 3. Many who had fled joined partisan units. Others hid in villages under false identities. Some wandered for months before finding shelter. Several were captured and executed later in the war. Every day of survival required caution. But survival meant one thing above all: the possibility of speaking. When the war ended in 1945, the world was confronted with the scale of the Holocaust, the camps of Auschwitz, Majdanek, Bergen-Belsen. Photographs and film exposed skeletal survivors and piles of corpses. Yet Sobibór, dismantled and plowed under, left almost nothing visible behind. Without its survivors, it might have faded into obscurity. Instead, names began to surface: Thomas Blatt, Philip Bialowitz, Esther Raab, and, most famously, Alexander Petchersky, whose leadership during the revolt would later become central to historical reconstruction. In displaced persons camps across Europe, survivors gave statements to investigators. They described the trains, the selection process, the forced undressing, the path to the gas chambers disguised as showers. They spoke of the tube, the fenced corridor leading to Camp 3. They recounted the uprising in precise detail. Their accounts were consistent. Sobibór had been built solely for killing. In the years immediately after the war, justice was uneven and slow. Many SS officers disappeared into civilian life. Some changed identities. Others claimed they had merely followed orders. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted high-ranking Nazi leaders, but lower-level camp personnel often escaped scrutiny at first. It would take decades for Sobibór's story to resurface in courtrooms. In the 1960s, West Germany began investigating former camp staff more seriously. Trials were held in Hagen, where several Sobibór guards faced prosecution. Testimony from survivors proved essential. Without physical ruins, the case relied on memory. Witnesses described specific acts of cruelty. They identified guards by name and behavior. They reconstructed the chain of command. Some defendants were convicted. Many received relatively light sentences. Others were acquitted. Justice, like memory, was imperfect. Yet the revolt itself had ensured one undeniable outcome. Sobibór could not be erased completely. In the decades that followed, historians pieced together the camp structure through survivor accounts, Nazi documents recovered elsewhere, and archaeological research. Excavations in the early 21st century uncovered foundations of gas chambers and personal belongings buried beneath the soil, silent confirmation of what witnesses had long described. A memorial now stands at the site, where once trains arrived carrying victims who believed they were being resettled. There is forest and stone markers. The air is quiet. Visitors walk paths that once led to death. But Sobibór's legacy is not defined solely by destruction. It is defined by defiance. The uprising of October 14, 1943 remains one of the only successful large-scale revolts inside a Nazi extermination camp. It demonstrated that even in a system designed to eliminate hope, resistance could emerge. It also revealed a crucial truth about the Holocaust. Genocide depends on secrecy as much as violence. Sobibór's planners assumed no one would survive to describe it. The camp was small. Its victims were killed immediately. Bodies were buried and later burned. Evidence was destroyed. The revolt broke that logic. Because 60 survivors were enough. Enough to testify. Enough to ensure that Sobibór's name would be recorded alongside Auschwitz and Treblinka. Enough to prove that extermination was systematic, organized, and deliberate. Enough to remind future generations that even in places designed for absolute control, human beings are capable of choice. Choice to resist. Choice to remember. Choice to speak. Sobibór no longer stands as it once did. There are no barracks filled with prisoners.
No smęczących transports.
No smoke rising from hidden chambers. But the story remains. And as long as it is told, the attempt to erase it has failed. In the next chapter, we will step back and examine Sobibór within the wider framework of Operation Reinhard, how it functioned as part of a coordinated network of death camps, and how industrialized extermination was refined across occupied Poland. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Operation Reinhard, the system behind Sobibór. Sobibór was never meant to stand alone. It was one component in a larger design, a coordinated system of extermination that operated with chilling efficiency across occupied Poland. To understand Sobibór fully, we must step back and examine the framework that gave it purpose. Operation Reinhard. Named after Reinhard Heydrich, one of the chief architects of the final solution, Operation Reinhard was the code name for the systematic murder of the Jews of the General Government, the central region of occupied Poland. It was not improvised chaos. It was organized policy. The decision for total extermination did not happen in a single moment. It evolved through stages: ghettos, forced labor, mass shootings by the Einsatzgruppen in the Soviet Union. But by late 1941, Nazi leadership sought a method that would be faster, more controlled, and less psychologically burdensome for the perpetrators. Mass shootings had proven effective, but they were inefficient and left visible evidence. They also required direct confrontation between shooter and victim, something some commanders feared might weaken morale. Operation Reinhard offered a different solution. Fixed killing centers built for one purpose only: immediate extermination upon arrival. 3 camps formed the core of this system: Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka. Unlike concentration camps such as Dachau or Buchenwald, these sites were not designed for long-term imprisonment. They had no large barracks for extended labor. They had no elaborate administrative compounds. Their layouts were streamlined for rapid processing. Unloading area, undressing zone, path to gas chambers, burial or cremation site. Victims arrived by train, often believing they were being resettled for work. Within hours, sometimes minutes, most were dead. Sobibor's function within Operation Reinhard was precise. It primarily received transports from eastern Poland, the Netherlands, Slovakia, and parts of Germany and Austria. Each transport was logged, processed, and erased. The system relied on deception. Signs indicated transit camp or bathhouse. Guards shouted instructions that mimicked routine procedures. Prisoners were told to tie shoes together to retrieve them later. Luggage was labeled to create the illusion of temporary separation. The machinery depended not only on violence but on order. Rail schedules were coordinated with the Reichsbahn. Deportation lists were prepared by local authorities and Jewish councils under coercion. Bureaucratic paperwork ensured that entire communities could be removed with minimal public disruption. Operation Reinhard was overseen by Odilo Globoknik, SS and police leader in Lublin. Under his command, construction began rapidly in early 1942. Within months, Belzec was operational. Sobibór followed in May 1942. Treblinka opened shortly after. The speed was staggering. In less than 2 years, approximately 1.7 to 2 million Jews were murdered under Operation Reinhard. It was one of the most concentrated killing operations in history. Sobibor's relatively small physical footprint concealed its lethality. The camp covered a limited area compared to Auschwitz, yet its death toll was immense. The absence of large labor complexes made it easier to dismantle later, but also meant that survival chances for arrivals were almost non-existent. Within the Operation Reinhard structure, only a small fraction of deportees were selected for forced labor within the camps. These prisoners sorted belongings, maintained infrastructure, and disposed of bodies. They were witnesses forced to sustain the system that would eventually kill them. The coordination between camps was deliberate. Techniques refined in Belzec were improved in Sobibór and Treblinka. Gas chamber capacity increased. Burial methods evolved into systematic cremation to eliminate evidence. Administrative language became standardized. Each camp learned from the others. Each became more efficient. By mid-1943, Operation Reinhard had largely accomplished its goal: the near-total destruction of Jewish communities in the general government. Entire towns that had existed for centuries vanished. Synagogues stood empty. Market squares fell silent. Records marked, evacuated, concealed annihilation. Sobibór, in this context, was both a killing site and a cog in a larger mechanism. Its uprising in October 1943 disrupted that mechanism, not in scale but in symbolism. The revolt occurred just as Operation Reinhard was nearing completion. The majority of targeted populations had already been murdered. The camps were beginning to wind down operations. And yet, the uprising forced the SS to confront something they had not anticipated: exposure. Because Operation Reinhard depended on secrecy as much as efficiency. The camps were hidden in remote areas. Victims were told they were being relocated. Even many German civilians did not know the full extent of what was happening. When Sobibor's prisoners escaped and carried their testimony into the forests, that secrecy fractured. The destruction of the camp that followed was part of a broader effort to close Operation Reinhard cleanly. Belzec and Treblinka had already been dismantled. Sobibór would be erased as well. But the system it belonged to could not be undone so easily. Operation Reinhard marked a turning point in the Holocaust. It demonstrated that genocide could be industrialized with extraordinary speed. It showed how modern bureaucracy, rail transport, administrative coordination, and ideological indoctrination could converge into a single purpose: total annihilation. Sobibór was one node in that network, a place where trains arrived on schedule, where deception masked death, where efficiency measured destruction, and where, for one day in October 1943, that efficiency was interrupted by resistance. In the next segment, we will examine how Sobibor's structure and routines mirrored and diverged from the other Reinhard camps, and how its internal design shaped both its lethality and the possibility of revolt. Chapter 8, Segment 2. The Daily Machinery of Operation Reinhard. To understand Sobibór in its final months, we must return to the rhythm of its days, the routine that made mass murder appear systematic, even ordinary, to those who operated it. Operation Reinhard did not rely on constant improvisation. It relied on repetition. Trains arrived according to schedule. Guards stood at assigned posts. Orders were shouted in rehearsed patterns. Every movement inside Sobibór had been designed to eliminate hesitation. The goal was speed, not chaos. A transport would pull into the camp siding, often after days in sealed cattle cars. Inside, men, women, and children stood pressed together without food or sanitation. Many were already dead when the doors were opened. The platform at Sobibór was intentionally modest. It was not built to resemble a terminal of arrival, but a controlled transfer point. SS officers and Ukrainian auxiliaries formed lines. Dogs barked. Whistles pierced the air. The victims were told they had reached a transit camp. Some were told they would be disinfected before being sent to work. Others were told they would shower before resettlement. The lies varied slightly depending on the origin of the transport, but the theme remained consistent: order and temporary inconvenience. Separation came quickly. Men were directed one way, women and children another. The elderly were assisted, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, depending on the mood of the guards and the urgency of the schedule. Those selected for immediate death were marched toward the undressing barracks. They were instructed to leave clothing neatly folded. Valuables were to be handed over for safekeeping. Shoes were tied together so they could be retrieved later. The illusion was essential. Panic slowed the process. Panic created resistance, and resistance disrupted efficiency. The path from the undressing barracks to the gas chambers was concealed by fencing and branches. Prisoners who worked inside the camp referred to it as the tube, a narrow, enclosed corridor designed to prevent those waiting from seeing what lay ahead. At the end stood the gas chambers. In Sobibor's early phase, the chambers were smaller, adapted from a simple structure. Later, they were expanded to increase capacity. Carbon monoxide from engine exhaust was pumped into sealed rooms. Within minutes, the process was complete. The bodies were removed by forced labor prisoners, the Sonderkommando. They were ordered to search for hidden valuables. Rings swallowed in desperation, gold teeth sewn in currency. Hair was sometimes cut. Everything had a function in the larger economic system of the Reich. At first, bodies were buried in mass graves in nearby forest clearings. As the graves filled and decomposition threatened exposure, new methods were adopted. Large cremation pits were constructed. Bodies were exhumed and burned to destroy evidence. Smoke drifted through the trees. Ash settled into soil, and the trains continued. Operation Reinhard depended on administrative precision beyond the camp gates. Deportations required coordination between local authorities, railway officials, and SS command. Entire communities were rounded up under orders that cited resettlement to the east. Lists were typed. Names were checked. Property was inventoried and confiscated. The victims' former homes were reassigned. Businesses were seized. Furniture was auctioned. Clothing sorted in Sobibór was sent back into circulation. The murder process and the economic system operated simultaneously. Sobibór's guards rotated shifts. Meals were served in the SS compound. Music sometimes played from the radio. The contrast between the outer camp, where thousands perished, and the inner compound, where perpetrators relaxed, reveals the moral fracture at the heart of Operation Reinhard. For the prisoners selected to work inside the camp, survival was a temporary condition. They cleaned barracks, sorted belongings, cut hair, removed bodies, repaired fences, built extensions. They were forced to participate in the functioning of the camp, knowing that they too would eventually be replaced and killed. New transports replenished labor needs. Old workers disappeared. The cycle was continuous. Sobibór, like Belzec and Treblinka, had no long-term prisoner population by design. The absence of large labor industries meant that most arrivals were exterminated immediately. Only a few hundred prisoners were kept alive at any given time to maintain operations. This small internal population would later make organized revolt possible. But during the peak of Operation Reinhard in 1942 and early 1943, revolt seemed unimaginable. Guards carried weapons. Watchtowers overlooked the perimeter. Mines were placed in certain areas beyond the fences. The camp appeared sealed. Yet cracks began to form not from external pressure, but from within the broader war. By mid-1943, Germany faced mounting military setbacks. The Red Army pushed westward. Allied bombing intensified. Resources became strained. And whispers of resistance in other camps reached even Sobibór. Meanwhile, Operation Reinhard's primary objective, the annihilation of Jewish communities in central Poland, was nearing completion. Transports became less frequent. The camp's workload shifted increasingly toward destruction of evidence. Prisoners were ordered to dig up mass graves. Bodies were burned on grates made of railway tracks. Ash was crushed and scattered. The forest floor was leveled. Trees were planted to conceal disturbed ground. The system that had once functioned with relentless forward motion began to turn inward, attempting to erase itself. And yet, the very act of forcing prisoners to exhume and burn bodies created deeper awareness of what was happening. Laborers who might once have clung to uncertainty could no longer deny the full scope of murder. Knowledge sharpened resolve. Operation Reinhard's machinery was still functioning, but it was no longer invulnerable. In the next segment, we will follow the final months of Sobibór within Operation Reinhard. The decision to dismantle the camp, the escalation of secrecy, and the uprising that disrupted the final chapter of the extermination network. Chapter 8, Segment 3. The Revolt and the End of Sobibór. By late 1943, Sobibór was no longer simply a killing center operating at full capacity. It had become a site preparing for its own disappearance. Operation Reinhard was nearing completion. The Jewish communities of central Poland had been largely annihilated. Belzec had already been dismantled. Treblinka was being reduced, its buildings destroyed and the land disguised as a farm. Sobibór stood as one of the last functioning links in a chain of extermination camps designed to leave no trace. Inside the fences, the prisoners sensed the shift. Transports were fewer. Work assignments increasingly focused on digging up old graves and burning remains. Forest clearings filled with smoke from massive pyres. Ash was crushed into powder and scattered across the surrounding land. The message was clear. The camp was preparing to erase itself. For the prisoners forced to carry out this labor, the implication was even clearer. If Sobibór disappeared, so would they. Unlike concentration camps that relied heavily on long-term labor forces, Sobibór's small internal prisoner population existed only to maintain the machinery of death. Once the machinery was dismantled, the workers would be unnecessary witnesses. Rumors circulated quietly among the barracks. Men spoke in whispers after roll call. Women passed information in coded language while sorting clothing. There would be no evacuation to another camp. There would be no liberation. There would be execution. The idea of revolt had surfaced before, but always as an abstract hope. Guards were armed. Watchtowers ringed the perimeter. Mines were believed to lie beyond the fences. Escape seemed impossible. Yet desperation has its own logic. In September 1943, a new group of prisoners arrived, Soviet Jewish prisoners of war transferred from a labor camp in Minsk. Among them was Lieutenant Alexander Pechersky, a Red Army officer. Unlike many previous arrivals, these men had military experience, discipline, and a mindset shaped by combat. Pechersky quickly grasped the reality of Sobibór. He also understood something crucial. If revolt was to happen, it would need coordination, secrecy, and speed. He connected with existing prisoner leaders, including Leon Feldhendler, a Polish Jew who had already been quietly considering resistance. Together, they formed a small underground network. The plan that emerged was both simple and audacious. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the guards, they would eliminate them one by one, luring them into workshops under pretense of fitting boots or inspecting clothing. Weapons would be seized quietly. Communication lines would be cut. Then, at a signal, prisoners would storm the main gate and attempt to escape into the surrounding forest. Secrecy was essential. Only a limited number of prisoners were informed of the full plan. Others would be told at the last moment to avoid leaks. The risk of betrayal loomed constantly. Informants existed in many camps. A single whisper to the wrong ear would mean immediate execution. October 14, 1943. The day began like any other. Roll call, work assignments, guard routines. In the afternoon, the first SS officer was lured into a tailor shop under the promise of a new coat. Inside, he was attacked with an axe and killed silently. His body was hidden beneath clothing. Another guard was summoned to inspect boots. He too disappeared. One by one, several SS officers were eliminated in carefully timed intervals. Prisoners moved with controlled urgency. Each successful killing brought both hope and heightened danger. If discovered too soon, the entire plan would collapse. By late afternoon, the moment arrived. Prisoners gathered near the assembly area. A signal was given. Confusion erupted. Some prisoners understood instantly and ran. Others hesitated, unsure of what was happening. Gunfire broke out. The main gate proved more heavily guarded than expected. Some prisoners rushed toward the perimeter fence instead. Mines exploded in the grass. Guards opened fire from watchtowers. Chaos replaced careful planning. Yet hundreds ran. They cut through barbed wire. They trampled over fallen bodies. They sprinted into the surrounding woods, pursued by bullets and dogs. Approximately 300 prisoners escaped the campgrounds that day. Not all survived. In the days that followed, German units and local collaborators hunted escapees through forests and villages. Many were captured and executed. Others were betrayed. A smaller number managed to hide, aided by sympathetic civilians or partisan networks. In the end, around 50 escapees are believed to have survived the war. From a military perspective, the revolt did not destroy Sobibór's infrastructure in the way the prisoners had hoped. But from a historical perspective, it accomplished something far more powerful. It shattered the myth of total submission. The uprising forced the SS to accelerate Sobibór's closure. Within weeks, the camp was dismantled. Buildings were destroyed. The site was plowed over. Trees were planted to disguise the land. A farmhouse was constructed to suggest agricultural use. Sobibór ceased to exist as an operational camp. The revolt had disrupted Operation Reinhard's final chapter. It also ensured that witnesses survived. Those who escaped carried testimony into the post-war world. They described the layout of the camp, the functioning of the gas chambers, the structure of daily life, and the mechanics of deception. Their accounts became foundational to historical understanding. Without the Sobibór revolt, the camp might have remained even more obscured than it already was. The SS had intended silence. Instead, resistance forced memory into the open. In the next chapter, we will follow the dismantling of Operation Reinhard itself, how Belzec, Treblinka, and Sobibór were erased from the landscape, how perpetrators attempted to escape justice, and how post-war investigations slowly reconstructed the truth from ashes and testimony. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Dismantling Operation Reinhard. By the winter of 1943, the killing centers of Operation Reinhard were no longer expanding, they were disappearing. Belzec had already been dismantled. Treblinka was being leveled. Sobibór, shaken by revolt, was ordered closed. The vast machinery that had murdered nearly 2 million Jews in less than 2 years was now being methodically erased. But erasure did not mean remorse. It meant concealment. The men who had supervised deportations, organized transports, overseen gas chambers, and coordinated burial pits understood that the war was turning. The Red Army was advancing from the east. German defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk had shattered the illusion of invincibility. Allied bombing raids were intensifying. The possibility of occupation and investigation loomed closer each month. Operation Reinhard had been built in secrecy. Now it had to vanish in secrecy. Orders were issued under a new codename, Operation 1005. Its purpose was simple and horrifying. Exhume mass graves, burn the bodies, crush the bones, and scatter the ashes so thoroughly that no trace of extermination would remain. At Sobibór and Treblinka, Jewish prisoners were forced to dig up decomposing corpses from enormous pits. Wooden pyres were constructed from railway tracks and timber. Bodies were stacked in layers and burned continuously. The stench of smoke drifted for miles. Ash was sifted through metal screens. Larger bone fragments were crushed with mallets. The remains were mixed with soil and spread across fields. The work was systematic. It was also temporary. Once prisoners completed these tasks, they were usually executed, witnesses eliminated alongside evidence. Forests were replanted. Farmhouses erected. Grass seeded over graves. In some cases, livestock were introduced to create the illusion of normal agricultural land. Maps were altered. Documentation minimized. To an uninformed passerby, nothing remained. Yet beneath the soil lay undeniable truth. As the camps were dismantled, personnel were reassigned. Many SS officers from Operation Reinhard were transferred to Italy to suppress partisan resistance. Others were absorbed into different SS and police units. A few attempted to fade into bureaucratic roles far from the Eastern Front. The system did not collapse overnight. It dispersed. Meanwhile, concentration camps like Majdanek and Auschwitz continued operating. Deportations persisted. Mass shootings and forced labor expanded as the Reich grew more desperate. Even as Reinhard camps closed, the larger structure of genocide remained active. But something fundamental had shifted. The industrial annihilation of Polish Jewry, the central objective of Operation Reinhard, had largely been completed. Entire communities were gone. Cities that once held vibrant Jewish populations were left silent. Synagogues stood empty or destroyed. Schools, markets, neighborhoods erased not only physically but demographically. In the administrative language of the Reich, success was measured in numbers. In reality, it was measured in absence. By mid-1944, the front lines moved rapidly westward. The Red Army liberated Majdanek in July 1944, capturing it largely intact. This unexpected preservation shocked German authorities. They had not anticipated losing the site so quickly. Evidence remained visible: gas chambers, crematoria, warehouses of belongings. The lesson was immediate. Other camps had to be evacuated or destroyed before Allied arrival. Thus began the death marches. Prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers through snow and freezing temperatures. Those who collapsed were shot. Thousands died from exposure and exhaustion. The marches were both a continuation of killing and an extension of concealment. Empty camps left behind fewer witnesses. Operation Reinhard camps, however, were already gone. Their destruction had preceded the final collapse of the Reich. The Nazis believed that without buildings, without records, without living prisoners, the story would fragment. But fragments remained. Escaped prisoners from Sobibór and Treblinka survived long enough to testify. Polish resistance networks had documented rumors and reports. Railway records existed. German paperwork, even when coded, left patterns. And in some forests, despite attempts at leveling and planting, the soil still bore signs of disturbance. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the physical sites of Operation Reinhard had largely vanished from the landscape. But history does not depend only on structures. It depends on memory. In the next segment, we turn to the immediate aftermath of war, how the Allied powers confronted evidence of genocide, how perpetrators were identified and prosecuted, and how the name Operation Reinhard slowly emerged from secrecy into historical record. Chapter 9, Segment 2. Trials, Testimony, and the Search for Justice. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the physical map of Operation Reinhard had already been wiped nearly clean. Belzec was a field. Sobibór was forest and farm. Treblinka had been plowed into anonymity. The buildings were gone. The barbed wire dismantled. The watchtowers erased from the skyline. But the men who had run those camps were not gone. They were scattered, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, some already preparing their alibis. In the first chaotic months after Germany's surrender, the Allied powers faced a problem unlike any in history. They had defeated a state that had turned mass murder into administrative routine. Millions were dead. Entire populations erased. And yet the crime scenes themselves had been partially destroyed. The evidence existed, but it was fragmented: documents here, testimony there, abandoned records in ministries, rail schedules, coded telegrams, survivor statements written in trembling handwriting. The world demanded answers, and so began the process of accountability. The most famous of the early proceedings were the International Military Tribunal trials in Nuremberg. There, top Nazi leaders were prosecuted for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace. The Holocaust, still a word not yet widely used, was introduced as evidence of systematic extermination. But Operation Reinhard did not stand alone in those first trials. The camps of Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka were referenced, but many of the individuals who had operated them were not seated in the main courtroom. They were mid-level administrators, camp commandants, transport coordinators, guards, men who had not been at the very top of the Reich's hierarchy, but who had overseen death on a daily basis. Justice for them would take years. Some were captured quickly. Others vanished into displaced persons camps or adopted false identities. A few fled abroad. In the immediate aftermath of war, Europe was flooded with refugees, former soldiers, civilians uprooted by bombing and occupation. Records were incomplete. Borders shifted. Chaos created opportunities for escape. Still, investigations continued. Survivors became essential witnesses. Those who had escaped Sobibór during the uprising. Those who had survived Treblinka by hiding or fleeing during transport. Those who had been forced to perform labor within the killing centers and lived long enough to testify. Their words became living evidence. They described the layout of camps, the procedures of arrival, the deception of showers, the engine rooms where carbon monoxide was pumped into sealed chambers, the screams that faded into silence, the burial pits, the burning pyres. These testimonies did something the destroyed buildings could not. They reconstructed the crime. In the 1950s and 1960s, West Germany began a series of domestic trials against former camp personnel. The Treblinka trials in Dusseldorf, the Sobibór trial in Hagen, and later proceedings involving Operation Reinhard officials revealed details that had once been hidden behind barbed wire and forest. Defendants often claimed ignorance. They insisted they were following orders. They minimized their roles. They described themselves as minor functionaries caught in a larger machine. But the courts examined documentation, transport lists, duty rosters, correspondence. And they listened to survivors who identified guards by face, by voice, by habit. The process was slow, painfully slow. Years had passed. Memories had faded. Some perpetrators had died. Others had blended into civilian life. A few lived decades without prosecution. Yet the trials established something crucial. Operation Reinhard was not rumor. It was documented policy. The proceedings also revealed the bureaucratic precision behind the extermination network. How trains were scheduled to maximize efficiency. How belongings were cataloged and redistributed. How gold teeth were extracted and melted down. How statistics were compiled and reported upward. The horror was not chaotic. It was organized. The world, learning these details, began to understand that genocide could operate within modern administrative structures, using paperwork, logistics, and hierarchy. In Poland, investigations into campsites uncovered physical traces beneath the soil. At Treblinka and Sobibór, archaeological studies decades later confirmed the existence of mass graves despite Nazi attempts to erase them. Even without intact buildings, the earth retained evidence. Memorials were eventually constructed, markers placed where gas chambers once stood, stones engraved with the names of destroyed communities. Memory became a form of resistance, but justice remained incomplete. Many low-level guards escaped prosecution entirely. Some cases collapsed due to lack of evidence. Others resulted in relatively light sentences compared to the scale of crime. The gap between atrocity and punishment was vast. And yet, every trial carried weight. Each testimony forced acknowledgement. Each verdict, even imperfect, contradicted the Nazi plan of total erasure. Operation Reinhard had been designed to leave no witnesses. Instead, it left survivors who spoke. It left court records that endure in archives. It left a historical record that could not be dynamited away. In the final segment of this chapter, we turn to remembrance, how the sites of Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka transformed from attempted oblivion into places of memorial, and what Operation Reinhard means for the modern world that inherited its history. Chapter 9, Segment 3. Memory in the Forest, From Erasure to Remembrance. When the killing stopped, the forests remained. At Sobibór, Wind moved through pine trees planted by the perpetrators themselves. At Treblinka, a farmhouse stood where gas chambers had once operated. At Belzec, grass covered the soil beneath which hundreds of thousands had been buried and burned. For years after the war, these places appeared almost ordinary to anyone passing by. And that ordinariness was part of the final crime. Operation Reinhard had not only been an extermination campaign. It had been an erasure campaign. The Nazis intended these camps to vanish without trace. No ruins, no witnesses, no record. If the buildings disappeared and the ground was reshaped, they believed history itself could be rewritten. But history does not disappear simply because it is hidden. In the immediate post-war years, attention focused heavily on larger and more intact camps such as Auschwitz. Operation Reinhard's sites, deliberately dismantled and located in remote areas, did not initially receive the same global recognition. Survivors were few. Physical evidence was limited. Many families never knew precisely where their loved ones had been murdered. Yet memory persisted quietly. In Poland, local communities remembered. They had seen trains pass. They had heard rumors. They had noticed smoke rising beyond tree lines. In Jewish communities across Europe and beyond, survivors spoke of places with names many had never heard before the war: Sobibór, Treblinka, Belzec. Gradually, memorials began to take shape. At Treblinka, a vast symbolic cemetery of stone markers was constructed, each stone representing a destroyed Jewish community. No names of victims could fill that space. There were too many, and most records had been destroyed. Instead, the landscape itself became testimony. At Sobibór, a memorial mound was raised over mass graves. Later, archaeological excavations revealed foundations of gas chambers, confirming survivor accounts in physical detail. The soil held fragments, keys, jewelry, buttons, silent witnesses embedded in the earth. At Belzec, a powerful modern memorial transformed the former campsite into a field of fractured stone, cut by a narrow corridor descending toward a wall inscribed with victims' names were known. It is a place designed not to reconstruct buildings, but to confront absence. Absence became architecture. The act of remembrance evolved beyond monuments. It entered classrooms, museums, archives, and international law. Operation Reinhard became central to understanding how the Holocaust functioned as a system. The lessons drawn from it reshaped definitions of genocide and crimes against humanity. But remembrance is not static. It requires vigilance. In the decades following the war, Holocaust denial emerged. Attempts to minimize or outright reject the scale and reality of extermination. Operation Reinhard camps, because they were dismantled, became targets for distortion. Deniers pointed to the absence of standing structures as supposed proof of exaggeration. Yet survivor testimony, Nazi documentation, transport records, and forensic evidence formed a body of proof too extensive to erase. Historians reconstructed timelines. Scholars examined correspondence between SS officials. Court transcripts preserved first-hand accounts. Memory strengthened through documentation. Today, visitors walk through forests that once concealed industrial murder. They read plaques. They stand before symbolic stones. They learn names of towns whose Jewish populations were annihilated within months. The silence of these places is no longer empty. It is intentional. It invites reflection rather than spectacle. There are no towering gates or dramatic ruins. Instead, there is space, and the understanding that beneath that space lie stories that demand acknowledgement. Operation Reinhard represents one of the most lethal chapters of the Holocaust. Nearly 2 million people were murdered in just 2 years. Entire communities disappeared with such speed that neighbors scarcely grasped what was happening. And yet, despite the Nazi effort to obliterate every trace, the story survived. It survived through those who escaped Sobibór's fences, through fragments of paperwork left in abandoned offices, through train manifests and coded messages, through ashes buried in Polish soil, through trials decades later, through historians who refused to let footnotes remain footnotes. Most importantly, it survived through memory passed from generation to generation. Operation Reinhard demonstrates a truth both devastating and urgent. Genocide does not only rely on hatred. It relies on coordination, bureaucracy, silence, and the belief that the world will not look closely. The camps were hidden in forests, but the crime could not remain hidden forever. As this documentary concludes its examination of Operation Reinhard, what remains is not only the record of destruction, but the responsibility of remembrance. The forests still stand. The soil still holds its history. The names where known are spoken. And in speaking them, we defy the original intention of erasure. The camps were meant to disappear. They did not, because memory endures. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The Architecture of Erasure. How Operation Reinhard was designed to disappear. Operation Reinhard was not only designed to kill, it was designed to vanish. From the very beginning, the architects of the extermination camps at Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka understood something critical. Secrecy was as important as efficiency. These were not camps meant for display, nor for long-term imprisonment. They were not meant to stand as symbols. They were meant to operate quietly, swiftly, and then dissolve into the landscape as if they had never existed. Unlike Auschwitz, which expanded into a massive complex with industrial infrastructure and a long wartime lifespan, the Operation Reinhard camps were temporary machines. Their sole purpose was the rapid extermination of Jewish communities in occupied Poland. Once that objective was achieved, the camps themselves would become liabilities. And so, their destruction was written into their existence. Each camp was placed in relative isolation, near railway lines for transport access, yet shielded by forests and distance from major population centers. The surrounding trees were not incidental. They were part of the concealment strategy. From the outside, these sites revealed little. There were no towering brick gates proclaiming ideology. There were wooden fences, watchtowers, and carefully restricted sight lines. Even prisoners inside were kept from seeing the full structure of the camps. Gas chambers were hidden behind barriers and deceptive signage. New arrivals were told they were being processed for labor in the East. Every element, from painted facades to fake ticket counters, served the illusion. The deception reduced resistance, but it also minimized witnesses. Once transports were unloaded and victims murdered, personal belongings were sorted, cataloged, and shipped back into the German economy. Clothing, gold teeth, currency, jewelry, all processed with bureaucratic precision. Paperwork recorded numbers, shipments, quotas. Language was sanitized. Reports avoided words like killing and instead referred to special treatment. Industrial murder wrapped in administrative language. When the mass deportations of Polish Jewry reached their peak in 1942 and early 1943, the camps operated at relentless speed. Entire communities vanished within weeks. The system functioned with brutal efficiency. Arrival, undressing, gassing, burial, or burning, clearing the space, preparing for the next transport. But by late 1943, the objective was nearly complete. The majority of Poland's Jewish population had been murdered. Resistance uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibór had demonstrated that secrecy could fracture. The Red Army was advancing steadily from the east. The camps were no longer assets. They were evidence. Orders came down to dismantle them. Structures were torn apart. Gas chambers were demolished. Barracks were burned or dismantled for lumber. Fences were removed. Mass graves were opened under Operation 1005, and bodies were exhumed and burned to reduce physical proof. Ashes were scattered. The perpetrators attempted to erase not only buildings, but traces in the soil. At Treblinka, a farmhouse was constructed on the former campgrounds to create the appearance of agricultural normalcy. Trees were planted over mass graves. At Sobibór and Belzec, similar efforts reshaped the terrain. From above, these places were meant to look like ordinary woodland clearings. The goal was clear. When the war ended, no visible machinery of extermination would remain. This strategy of erasure was unprecedented in scale. It acknowledged the criminal nature of what had been done. It demonstrated that those responsible understood that history would judge them, and sought to deny history the tools to do so. But erasure is never perfect. Documents survived. Transport records were preserved in archives. Railway timetables told their own story. Survivors from uprisings testified. Local residents remembered smoke and trains. Later forensic investigations uncovered foundations, artifacts, and human remains beneath layers of soil. The landscape remembered. Operation Reinhard stands as a chilling example of how genocide can be engineered not only for maximum destruction, but for maximum disappearance. The camps were built to function like machines, and then to dismantle themselves like temporary scaffolding once the objective was complete. Yet even in their disappearance, they left patterns. Patterns of coordination between railway ministries, SS command structures, local administrations, and economic offices. Patterns of deception repeated across multiple sites. Patterns of bureaucratic communication that revealed intent. The attempt to erase evidence became evidence itself. Chapter 10 begins with this final phase, the deliberate destruction of the extermination camps. But it is also the beginning of another story, how investigators, historians, archaeologists, and survivors reconstructed what had been meant to vanish. Because while buildings can be torn down and soil can be turned over, systems leave traces. And memory has a way of returning to the surface. In the quiet forests of eastern Poland, beneath pine needles and grass, the blueprint of extermination remained hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. Chapter 10, Segment 2. After the smoke cleared, witnesses, trials, and the struggle for justice. When the camps of Operation Reinhard were dismantled, their architects believed they had erased the crime. But they underestimated something far more resilient than buildings. They underestimated testimony. By the time Soviet forces pushed westward into Poland in 1944, the extermination camps of Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka were already gone. No barracks remained standing. No gas chambers awaited discovery. What the liberators found were empty clearings, disturbed earth, scattered debris, and silence. At first glance, there was little to photograph. Unlike Majdanek or Auschwitz, which still contained intact crematoria and warehouses of belongings, the Reinhard camps offered no obvious physical spectacle of horror. The absence itself was unsettling. Entire populations had disappeared, yet the machinery that killed them had vanished too. This created a profound problem for justice. How do you prosecute a crime scene that has been erased? The answer began with survivors. Though the Reinhard camps were designed to leave almost no witnesses, they were not entirely successful. A small number of prisoners survived Belzec. At Sobibór and Treblinka, uprisings in 1943 allowed several dozen inmates to escape. Most were later hunted down and killed, but some survived the war. Their accounts became foundational. Survivors described the layout of the camps, the deceptive reception areas, the fenced pathways known as the tube, the gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. They recounted the sound of engines running, the screams that followed, the frantic sorting of belongings, the burial pits that filled and were later reopened to burn bodies. These testimonies were detailed, consistent, and devastating. In the immediate aftermath of the war, attention focused largely on the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. The major architects of the Nazi regime were prosecuted for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Operation Reinhard was mentioned, but the specific camps were not central to those early trials. Many perpetrators of the Reinhard camps were lower-ranking SS officers or police officials. Some had been killed during the war. Others disappeared into civilian life, blending into post-war Germany, Austria, or elsewhere in Europe. For years, accountability was incomplete. It was not until the 1960s that significant trials related to Operation Reinhard began to take shape in West Germany. The Sobibór trial in Hagen and the Treblinka trial in Dusseldorf brought former camp personnel into courtrooms where survivors confronted them face to face. The legal challenges were immense. Prosecutors had to reconstruct events from fragmented documents and witness memory. Defense attorneys often argued that defendants were merely following orders or had played minor roles. Establishing direct responsibility for specific murders was difficult, particularly when the physical sites had been destroyed. Yet the trials achieved something critical. They publicly affirmed the historical reality of the extermination camps. Survivor testimony was entered into official record. Judicial findings recognized the systematic, organized nature of the killings. Even when sentences were viewed by many as too lenient, the proceedings shattered decades of silence. The trials also exposed uncomfortable truths about post-war society. Some former camp personnel had resumed normal lives, working as laborers, clerks, or tradesmen. Communities that had lived near the camps during the war often claimed ignorance, though trains had passed regularly and smoke had risen over forests. Justice unfolded slowly, imperfectly. Meanwhile, historians and investigators began the painstaking process of documenting what had happened at the erased sites. Aerial photographs taken during the war were analyzed. Survivor sketches were compared to archival maps. Archaeologists conducted careful, non-invasive studies of former campgrounds to locate foundations and burial areas without disturbing human remains. The soil yielded fragments, personal items, structural traces, remnants of fencing. Each discovery reinforced survivor testimony. Operation Reinhard, once nearly invisible in physical form, became increasingly clear in documentary record. Internationally, the understanding of the Holocaust evolved. Scholars recognized Operation Reinhard as the deadliest phase of the genocide, responsible for the murder of approximately 1.7 to 2 million Jews in less than 2 years. The scale was staggering. Entire communities from Poland, Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and beyond were annihilated through this network alone. And yet, for decades, public memory often centered on Auschwitz as the dominant symbol of the Holocaust. The relative invisibility of Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka reflected the Nazis' partial success in destroying their own crime scenes. It required persistent scholarship and survivor advocacy to restore these sites to collective memory. Memorials were eventually established. At Treblinka, a field of symbolic stones now marks the location of the camp. At Sobibór and Belzec, memorial complexes and museums preserve the history while respecting the sanctity of mass graves. Educational programs bring visitors to places where nothing visible once remained. In this way, remembrance became a form of reconstruction. The attempt to erase Operation Reinhard failed, not because the buildings survived, but because the record survived. Testimony, documentation, and historical investigation combined to restore what perpetrators sought to conceal. Chapter 10's second movement is not about the machinery of killing, but about the machinery of accountability. It is about courtrooms instead of gas chambers, archives instead of forests, historians instead of guards. Justice did not come swiftly, but it came in fragments, and those fragments, assembled over decades, formed a historical truth too substantial to bury. The camps may have been dismantled, but their story endured. Chapter 10, Segment 3. Memory, Silence, and the Lessons of Sobibór. When Sobibór was erased, the forest returned. Trees grew where barracks once stood. Grass covered the mass graves. Birds nested in branches above soil that held the ashes of thousands. To a passerby, it could have seemed like any other quiet clearing in eastern Poland. Wind through leaves, sunlight breaking through branches, the ordinary calm of nature reclaiming land. But the silence was never empty. For years after the war, Sobibór remained largely absent from global consciousness. Unlike Auschwitz, which became an immediate and visible symbol of the Holocaust, Sobibór left behind almost nothing material. Its gas chambers had been demolished, its fences removed, its buildings dismantled. The Nazis had planted trees over burial pits to disguise what lay beneath. It was, in many ways, the perfect crime scene, not because the crime was flawless, but because it had been deliberately hidden. And yet, history does not depend solely on structures. It depends on memory. The survivors of Sobibór carried the camp with them long after they escaped its fences. Many rarely spoke of what they had endured. Trauma sealed their experiences into fragments, into nightmares, into silence. Some emigrated, building new lives in Israel, the United States, Australia, and elsewhere. Others remained in Europe, living quietly with the weight of knowledge that most of those they had known had not survived. For decades, the revolt at Sobibór remained one of the least known acts of resistance in the Holocaust. And yet it was extraordinary. In October 1943, prisoners, Jews from Poland, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union, organized a coordinated uprising within a camp designed to eliminate witnesses. They lured SS officers into workshops and killed them silently. They cut telephone wires. They rushed the fences. Hundreds attempted escape. Many were shot in minefields. Many were hunted down in the forests. But dozens survived the war. The revolt did not stop the genocide, but it shattered the illusion that death camps were places of passive submission. It revealed that even within the most controlled system of annihilation, human agency remained possible. As Holocaust scholarship expanded in the late 20th century, Sobibór began to reclaim its place in historical narrative. Testimonies were recorded on film. Survivor memoirs were published. Archival documents were unearthed and analyzed. Trials in Germany revisited the crimes committed within its fences. Archaeological investigations in the early 21st century located foundations of gas chambers and personal belongings buried beneath the soil, rings, keys, identification tags. Each artifact was both an object and a voice, restoring individuality to those reduced to numbers. Memorials were constructed, not to rebuild the camp, but to mark its absence. Today, Sobibór stands as both a site of mourning and a site of instruction. Its emptiness teaches something profound. It teaches that genocide does not always leave ruins. It teaches that bureaucratic language can conceal atrocity. It teaches that destruction can be systematic, organized, and frighteningly efficient. Operation Reinhard, of which Sobibór was a central part, represented one of the most concentrated phases of the Holocaust. In less than 2 years, nearly 2 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered in Belzec, Sobibór, and Treblinka. Entire communities vanished. Cultural worlds disappeared. Languages, songs, traditions erased within months. And yet, they are not entirely gone. Memory resists erasure. The legacy of Sobibór extends beyond numbers. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about modern systems. The camp was not medieval in its brutality. It was modern. It relied on timetables, fuel supplies, paperwork, coordination between railways and police units. It functioned because individuals performed assigned tasks within a structured hierarchy. No single action alone created the genocide. It was the accumulation of obedience. That is perhaps Sobibór's most enduring lesson. Evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves through memoranda and signatures. Sometimes it disguises itself as procedure. Sometimes it plants trees over graves and assumes the world will forget. But remembrance is an act of resistance. Every name recorded, every testimony preserved, every visitor who walks the path where the tube once stood, each act contradicts the perpetrator's final objective. They sought not only to kill, they sought to erase. Sobibór proves that erasure failed. The camp's physical structures are gone. The SS officers who commanded it are dead. The forests have grown tall again. But the story remains. It remains in archives and museums, in classrooms and documentaries, in the voices of descendants who carry family histories interrupted but not extinguished. As this chapter closes, we do not end with images of barbed wire or gas chambers. We end with a clearing in a forest, quiet, solemn, marked not by buildings but by memory. Sobibór stands as both warning and testament, a warning of how swiftly hatred, ideology, and bureaucracy can combine to annihilate millions, and a testament to the fact that even in a place designed for absolute control, courage could ignite rebellion. The forest may be silent, but the history speaks, and as long as it is told, the attempt to bury Sobibór will never fully succeed. Final outro. Sobibór. The revolt inside a death camp. Sobibór was built to leave nothing behind.
No prisoners.
No buildings.
No witnesses.
And yet, history survived. It survived in the footsteps of those who ran through the forest on October 14, 1943. It survived in the testimonies whispered years later in courtrooms and interviews. It survived in fragments of documents, in soil disturbed by archaeologists, in the quiet determination of historians who refused to let the story disappear. Sobibór was not the largest camp. It was not the most famous. But it represents something essential to understanding the Holocaust, how genocide could be organized with terrifying efficiency, and how even in a place designed only for death, resistance was still possible. The Nazis tried to erase Sobibór from the map. They tore down its structures. They planted trees. They attempted to make the forest forget. But memory outlasts destruction. When we study Sobibór, we do more than recount events. We examine how systems are built, how language disguises cruelty, how obedience becomes complicity, and how courage can emerge even in the darkest conditions. History is not meant to shock alone. It is meant to teach, to warn, to remind, because the Holocaust did not begin with camps. It began with ideas, and with the belief that some lives mattered less than others. Sobibór stands as proof of where that belief leads. If this documentary helped you understand this chapter of history more clearly, consider supporting the channel. Subscribe for more deeply researched World War II and Holocaust documentaries, told carefully, respectfully, and in a way designed to help you reflect, learn, and remember. Your support helps keep these stories alive. And as long as they are remembered, the silence the perpetrators sought will never fully return. Thank you for watching. Never forget,